Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. You know the drill. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready to drift off to 2 hours of strange, hilarious, and oddly emotional Family Guy lore. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers on Meg Griffin. Let's get into it.
We begin where it always begins, the pilot. Season 1, Episode 1. The Griffin family lands awkwardly on television screens, and Meg is there, not as a gag or a prop, but as a 15-year-old girl with a voice, literally and narratively. Voiced originally by Lacey Chabert, Meg had a tone that was unsure but clear, delivering her lines with the awkward sincerity of someone trying to find her place in a loud, chaotic family. The Meg we first meet isn't the Meg we later mock. She isn't a punching bag, she isn't invisible, and she's certainly not hated, yet. She's just a teenager dealing with high school, acne, insecurity, and the background radiation of being a Griffin. Her presence is timid, but earnest. She wants to fit in. She wants to be liked. She wants to be heard. But somewhere along the way, the writers stopped listening. As we settle deeper into this lore, you'll notice that Meg's evolution is not a straight line. It's a descent. From girl next door awkwardness to punchline of the week. And perhaps what makes her story so strangely compelling is that, unlike Peter's idiocy or Stewie's psychopathy, Meg's transformation wasn't planned. It happened slowly, subtly, and disturbingly. She became the show's sacrificial lamb. The family needed someone to absorb the chaos. It wasn't going to be Stewie, he was too smart. It wasn't going to be Brian, he was too suave. Chris was dumb, but he had innocence. Lois was the glue, Peter was the bomb, and Meg, well, Meg became the fallout. But in these early episodes, before the writers sharpened their knives, Meg had dreams. She wanted to join the cool kids. She wanted to be seen as beautiful. She wanted to matter. And what's most tragic is that in the world of Family Guy, wanting those things makes you a target. There's something haunting about watching those early episodes now. You can see her trying. You can hear her voice still full of hope. You can feel the show not yet sure of who it wants her to be. She's awkward, but she's not yet tragic. She's background, but she's not yet invisible. In many ways, Meg's early appearances are a quiet portrait of American teenagehood. She's caught between childhood and adulthood, between craving attention and fearing it. Her friends are shallow, her crushes are brutal, and her family, well, they're a mess. But she hasn't given up on them yet. That would come later. There's a beauty in these moments, even if they're wrapped in sitcom absurdity. Meg at the dinner table, trying to contribute. Meg nervously laughing at Peter's antics. Meg asking Lois for advice. She's still reaching, still hopeful, still part of the family, even if barely. But seeds were being planted. The writers were testing the waters, making her the butt of a joke here, a throwaway line there. And the audience, they laughed. Maybe too easily. Because here's the thing, Meg's role in Family Guy became a mirror to the audience's willingness to laugh at pain that wasn't theirs. Her loneliness became a comedy. Her rejection, a recurring punchline. Her face, a setup. And so the show leaned into it, harder and harder, until all that was left was the echo of a character who once mattered. Let's pause here. Imagine being born into a family where you were never meant to be heard. Now imagine growing up in front of millions of viewers and realizing that your pain has become entertainment. That's Meg's arc, if you can call it that. A descent into silence disguised as laughter. The show shifted. Lacey Chabert left the role due to other commitments, and in came Mila Kunis. Her voice sharper, less soft, more vulnerable somehow. Kunis brought a different energy to Meg, and for a moment, it looked like the character might find her footing. But it was too late. The spiral had begun. season after season, the jokes got crueler. The family's indifference turned into open hostility, and Meg, still awkward, still trying, just kept absorbing it, like a character trapped in a loop she could never break out of. In the lore of Family Guy, Meg is the character who suffers for everyone else's sins. Peter's stupidity, it lands on Meg. Lois's obsession with image, it lands on Meg. Stewie's chaos, Chris's cluelessness, Brian's arrogance, all somehow crash into Meg's corner, leaving her sweep up the emotional debris. But what if she wasn't just a victim? What if, somewhere buried deep inside all the jokes and jabs, Meg chose silence? What if the moment she realized the family wasn't listening, she stopped speaking? What if her quietness isn't weakness, but resistance? That's the theory we'll explore as we drift further into the shadows of her story. Because maybe Meg didn't disappear. Maybe she hid. Maybe, just maybe, she's still watching, still waiting. And perhaps, in the darkest corners of Quahog, she's finally ready to speak. And what if that silence wasn't surrender, but survival? It's a strange thing to think about, silence as an act of rebellion. But in a world as loud and absurd as Family Guy, silence is radical. It's disruptive. It forces the viewer to ask questions that the characters never do. Why doesn't Meg fight back? Why doesn't she yell? Why doesn't she scream her truth across the dinner table and force the world to hear her? Because she knows they won't. Because maybe she already did. Somewhere between season 2 and 3, the shift becomes more obvious. The jokes at Meg's expense become formulaic, an easy laugh, a scene closer, a way to punctuate Peter's wild rants or Lois's emotional distance. The character of Meg slowly fades from 3 dimensions to 2, flattened into a trope. The ignored, the unloved, the unwanted. Her voice, once full of trying, begins to sound tired. Not just performed tired, but written tired, as if the writers, too, had given up on her. The school scenes illustrate this best. Meg doesn't just have a hard time fitting in, she is actively rejected. Whether it's Connie D'Amico mocking her or the cheerleaders laughing in her face, Meg is never allowed to even exist within the fabric of normal teenage life. She is either invisible or ridiculed. There is no middle ground, and yet she still shows up, still gets dressed, still walks the halls. There's something quietly heroic in that. Imagine a life where every door you knock on gets slammed in your face. Now imagine you keep knocking anyway. Not because you expect it to open, but because doing so affirms that you still exist, that you're still here, that you haven't disappeared entirely. Meg's locker becomes a symbol of this, a place she opens, not to store books, but to remind herself there is still a space she owns, even if it's only a square foot metal and dust. Often we see her staring into it, sighing, closing it. In those tiny scenes, there's a whole world of emotion. Not anger, not even sadness, just emptiness. And that emptiness is louder than any scream. By the time we reach mid-series episodes, around seasons 4 to 6, Meg has fully become a function, not a character. She's the family's scapegoat, Quahog's afterthought, and the writer's favorite dartboard. Her pain is played for laughs, and her growth is either reset or erased. But here's what makes this chapter of her lore especially haunting. The audience becomes complicit. We laugh, we repeat the memes, we quote the lines, "Shut up, Meg." And in doing so, we reinforce the very cycle that the show critiques in its own broken way. Meg isn't just mistreated by her family, she's abandoned by the viewers, by us. And yet, buried in the chaos, there are flickers of something else. glimpses of the Meg that could have been. In Dial Meg for Murder, we see what happens when Meg snaps. When she's finally pushed too far, imprisoned, transformed. The episode gives us a Meg who's no longer awkward but violent. She fights, she leads, she dominates. She becomes feared. And it's telling that this version of Meg, for once, gets respect. From Peter, from Chris, even from Lois. But the respect only comes when she stops being herself. What does that say? That in the world of Family Guy, to be taken seriously, Meg has to become something monstrous. That to matter, she must shed her skin, silence her empathy, and wield power through fear. And the moment she returns to her usual self, the respect vanishes. The silence returns. It's tragic. But it's also a kind of grim prophecy. Because in a universe built on chaos, Meg is the quiet center. She's the eye of the storm, enduring everything without truly breaking, until one day, maybe she will. But let's not overlook the moments where the show, just for a breath, treats Meg like a human being. In Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg speaks out during a family acid trip. It's surreal, philosophical, and uncharacteristically honest. She calls out her family's cruelty. She doesn't just endure the pain, she names it. And for one rare episode, she becomes the moral compass, the gravity. Yet even that arc resets. It's a recurring theme. Whenever Meg grows, the universe resets her. Whenever she finds her voice, it's silenced. Not because she isn't interesting, but because the show needs her to be broken for the other characters to work. Meg's misery fuels Peter's ego, Lois's apathy, Chris's ignorance, and Stewie's superiority. She's the quiet fuel that keeps the engine running. And that's the dark lore buried under the surface. Meg Griffin is essential. Not in the way most main characters are, where they push the plot forward, but in the way furniture is essential in a room. You don't notice it unless it's gone. But without it, the space feels wrong, empty. She's the emotional wallpaper of Family Guy, always there, never changed, rarely acknowledged. And yet, without her, the show would collapse into itself because someone has to absorb the weight. Someone has to anchor the absurdity. Someone has to be the shadow that makes the rest of the cast shine. It's a heavy burden, and Meg carries it in silence. Let's reflect on her family relationships for a moment. Peter Griffin, her father, is perhaps her greatest tormentor. The cruelty is so exaggerated that it becomes a parody of itself. But at its core is the unsettling truth that Meg receives almost no paternal affection. He forgets her birthday. He sells her for a can of beer. He mocks her appearance. But maybe the worst part, he acts like she doesn't exist. Lois, her mother, is more complicated. Sometimes she defends Meg. Other times she joins in the cruelty. But at her most honest, Lois reveals something chilling. That she too sees Meg as a mistake. That Meg is the mirror she's afraid to look into. All of Lois's repressed guilt. All of her anxiety about fading youth and beauty. It projects onto Meg. Chris, her brother, should be her ally. They're both outsiders in their own way. But even Chris, in his innocence, ridicules Meg when the moment calls for it. Their relationship is erratic, sometimes warm, often cold, and never truly deep. Stewie and Brian, intellectual and ironic, mostly treat Meg with detached amusement. Occasionally there's sympathy, but more often there's distance. Meg is the one person in the family whose pain they choose not to understand. And so Meg becomes the emotional orphan in a house full of noise. That's the root of her lore. Not that she's ignored, but that she's ignored while everyone pretends she isn't. There's a loneliness to that, a ghost-like quality. She walks the halls. She shares the meals. She appears in the family photos, but her presence doesn't register. Her pain doesn't echo. And the world keeps turning without ever pausing to notice the girl who wasn't there. Meg Griffin, silent suffering, standing in the corner of every frame, isn't just a forgotten character. She is the show's conscience. And maybe that's why she's treated the way she is. Because to acknowledge Meg fully, to look her in the eye, is to acknowledge the cruelty that Family Guy builds its humor on. And that would be too much. Better to laugh. Better to forget. Better to say, shut up, Meg, and move on. But here in this quiet space where you and I are listening, we're not moving on. We're listening. And maybe that's all Meg ever wanted. But somewhere, buried under all the noise and silence, a different Meg flickers in and out of view. Not the invisible one, not the ridiculed one, but the possible one. The Meg that exists between edits, between jokes, between the cuts to Peter's chaos or Stewie's schemes. The Meg that the camera rarely lingers on, but who's always there. In the margins, in the corners, in the space where a possibility still breathes. You see it most clearly when she's alone, not just physically, but narratively. Those rare moments when Meg isn't being mocked or ignored, but simply existing. Sitting on her bed, doodling in a notebook, looking out the window while rain taps gently on the glass. These aren't punchlines. They're pauses. Little moments that suggest a life happening off-screen. We don't get many of them. But when we do, they whisper truths the rest of the show is too loud to hear. That Meg is thoughtful, that she feels deeply, that she has dreams, not just of popularity or love, but of escape, of a life where she isn't defined by what others say about her, but by what she creates for herself. We get hints, a sketchbook here, a short story there. Her aspirations to be a photographer. The fact that she joined the school newspaper, even if no one read it. These are not just scraps of character. They are fragments of a real inner world. A world where Meg Griffin might not be a joke. A world where she's the main character. Imagine it for a moment. A show where Meg gets to grow, where she's allowed to evolve past her role as the family's emotional sponge, where she travels, meets new people, finds someone who sees her, not despite her awkwardness, but because of it. A version of Family Guy where Meg gets to become whole. It's not hard to picture because, in moments, the show itself almost wants it too. There are episodes, short-lived, half-serious episodes, where we glimpse that future, where Meg is funny on her own terms, where she stands up for herself even if it's played for laughs, where she doesn't just endure but chooses. In Road to Rupert, she gets a dance with a boy who actually sees her. For a second, the camera softens. The joke pauses. And she smiles in a way that isn't rehearsed or pitiful. It's hopeful. The music swells, the colors warm, and it almost feels like the show is rooting for her. Of course, the moment passes. It always does. But that moment mattered. Because Family Guy, for all its cynicism and absurdity, still knows how to hint at humanity. It hides it well, beneath layers of sarcasm and cutaway gags. But it's there, and Meg is where it hides most vulnerably. She's the only character whose pain isn't played entirely for fantasy. Peter's injuries are cartoonish. Stewie's tantrums are diabolical. Brian's heartbreak is poetic. But Meg's loneliness, that's real. That's grounded. That's what makes her so quietly powerful. Because while everyone else floats through chaos, Meg is anchored in something true. That truth deepens when we look at how others treat her not out of hate, but fear. Fear that her existence reflects their failures. Peter fears Meg because she reminds him of his shortcomings as a father. Lois fears Meg because she sees the version of herself she abandoned. Chris avoids Meg because he's too close to her in station, too similar in his social fragility. Even Stewie, for all his intellect, avoids real conversations with Meg because he senses her emotional depth might swallow him whole. And Brian, the one who fancies himself the most aware, occasionally looks at Meg with something like guilt, because he knows. Deep down, he knows Meg is the only one in that house who hasn't wrapped herself in layers of distraction and denial. She's the one who sees everything and doesn't say a word. Not because she can't, but because no one would listen. Or worse, they'd listen and laugh. So she protects herself the only way she can, by retreating inward. By building a fortress of blank stares and mumbled okays. Not because she's numb, but because she feels too much. And when you feel too much in a world that doesn't care, you learn to look bored. It's safer that way. And yet, despite it all, she tries. That's the heartbreaking beauty of Meg Griffin. She keeps trying. She joins clubs. She applies for jobs. She shows up to school dances even when she knows she'll be mocked. She wears makeup not because it hides her flaws, but because it lets her pretend, just for a few hours, that she's someone the world might like. She says yes to invitations. She answers the phone when her family calls. She laughs when they joke, even if the joke's on her. And at the end of the day, she comes home. Home. To the same house, the same table, the same cold stares and careless insults. And she endures. Because maybe, just maybe, she believes there's still something worth enduring for. Maybe she holds on to the hope that someone will finally see her, not glance over her, not use her as a punchline, but really see her. That's why it hurts when she's dismissed, because we've seen enough to know there's more beneath the surface. And when a show offers you a glimpse of depth, then buries it under ridicule, the result isn't just comedy, it's tragedy. A silent one. But Meg's silence is layered. It's not just suppression. It's not just retreat. It's also observation. She notices things the others don't. She catches the hypocrisy, the patterns, the moments when her family reveals who they really are. She hears their whispers behind closed doors. She sees the shame in their eyes when the lights are off. She remembers. Meg is the family's living archive, the one who remembers everything they pretend to forget. That memory gives her power, a quiet power, one she rarely uses, but it's there. Because Meg knows the truth about her family, about herself, about the world she's trapped in. And truth, even unspoken, is never powerless. Still, the show never lets her speak the truth out loud, not fully. Because if Meg were to name what she knows, if she ever confronted her family, really confronted them, it would break the illusion. Not just for them, but for the audience, too. Because in her silence, Meg becomes something unsettling. She's a mirror, not just to her family, but to us. She reflects the loneliness we all try to laugh off, the desperation for approval, the ache of invisibility, the way we perform to fit in, only to realize we were never being watched in the first place. Meg Griffin, in her awkward pauses and hesitant smiles, reveals the most uncomfortable truth of all. That being ignored is sometimes worse than being hated. That anonymity can hollow you out until you don't even recognize your own voice. And maybe that's why Meg resonates in such a strange, quiet way. Because she taps into a fear we don't want to name. A fear that all of us, in some way, have known. The feeling of being present, but unseen. Of speaking, but not being heard. Of giving your heart to a world that responds with a shrug. That fear sits at the center of Meg's story. And yet, she doesn't collapse under it. She never fully gives in. She rolls her eyes. She slumps in her chair. She mutters a sarcastic reply. But she doesn't vanish. Not really. She endures. She adapts. She keeps showing up. There's a kind of heroism in that. Not the flashy kind. Not the cinematic, triumphant kind. But something subtler, more human. Meg is the kind of hero who survives without applause. Who gets out of bed each morning even though she knows what's waiting for her. Who walks through a house that mocks her and still offers kindness when she can. Who's been pushed to the edges of every scene and still find a way to matter. Because even if no one acknowledges it, Meg does matter. She is the connective tissue in a family that would otherwise fall apart. She is the one who babysits Stewie when no one else wants to. She is the one who helps Lois with groceries without being asked. She is the one who cleans the mess after Peter's disasters, who comforts Chris when he's scared, who answers the door, who remembers birthdays, who listens. The Griffin family runs on Meg's quiet labor, and they don't even realize it. But we do, because in watching her, we learn to pay attention to the margins, to the spaces where real emotion hides, to the people who carry more than they should and ask for less than they deserve. We start to see Meg not as a joke, but as a lesson in endurance, a lesson in overlooked strength, a lesson in how the world treats the ones it doesn't understand. And sometimes, Family Guy itself seems to realize this. There are those rare electric moments where Meg pushes back, where she stops laughing along, where she names the cruelty, where she forces her family and us to reckon with what they've done. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg explodes. She confronts Peter, Lois, Chris. She tells them everything. She names every insult, every cold shoulder, every time they let her suffer. And for once, they listen. They sit there stunned as she strips away their defense mechanisms and exposes their selfishness. For a moment, Meg isn't just the girl who wasn't there. She's the voice of truth. Unfiltered, unapologetic. It's not played for laughs. Not entirely. There's tension in the room. Real discomfort, because what Meg says isn't exaggerated. It's accurate. It's what we've all noticed, what we've all wanted to say. And in that moment, Meg becomes something bigger than a character. She becomes the audience's conscience. But of course, the show resets by the end. It always does. Meg's outburst is swept under the rug. The family goes back to normal. The status quo is restored. But we remember, and so does she. Because once you speak the truth, even if the world pretends not to hear it, something shifts. You shift. And Meg does change after that. Not drastically. Not enough to derail the show's rhythm. But enough that we notice a quiet confidence growing. A new kind of awareness. She's less desperate, less eager to please. Her jokes carry more bite. Her eyes don't beg for approval the way they used to. It's subtle. But it's there. A slow reclaiming of self. And that's where Meg's story becomes quietly revolutionary. Because she doesn't get a big redemption arc. She doesn't suddenly become popular. She doesn't escape Quahog in a blaze of glory. Instead, she starts to accept herself. Not because the world finally sees her, but despite the fact that it doesn't. And that is radical. Because in a show where everyone is chasing attention, validation, and power, Meg starts building something different. An identity that isn't borrowed from others. A self that isn't defined by rejection. She becomes, slowly, painfully, beautifully, her own person. That's why Meg's arc, for all its heartbreak, is strangely hopeful. Because she teaches us that being ignored doesn't erase your worth. That your value isn't determined by how others treat you. That you can be mocked, dismissed, sidelined, and still matter. Still grow. Still become. And perhaps that's the quiet promise tucked beneath every episode she appears in. That one day, someone will notice. That one day, someone will see her. Really see her. And when that day comes, they'll realize she was never invisible. She was just waiting. Waiting for the world to catch up. But Meg's waiting isn't passive. She's not just sitting quietly in the background, hoping someone will finally look her way. No, Meg Griffin is surviving in plain sight. She's adapting, learning the rules of a world that barely acknowledges her, and reshaping herself to exist within it. There's a strange power in being forgotten. In knowing that no one is watching, it means Meg can observe everything. While her family yells and stumbles and spirals in their loud, chaotic lives, Meg is silent. But she sees all. Every crack in their facades, every fragile ego, every hypocritical outburst. She learns where the fault lines are. And over time, she starts learning how to walk them. Meg's transformation isn't sudden. It's a slow-burning shift, visible only if you pay attention to the corners of the frame. It's in her timing, her knowing glances, her calculated responses. She begins to master her own invisibility, using it not as a curse, but as cover. There's one thing nobody ever suspects Meg of being: dangerous. And that's their first mistake. Because within her stillness is something potent. A mind that has been sharpened by loneliness. A soul that has been tempered by rejection. And while the rest of the Griffins chase distractions, Meg is quietly building something harder to define. A kind of internal armor. Her silence becomes strategy. Her awkwardness becomes shield. And her isolation, it becomes fuel. There's an episode, Dial Meg for Murder, where Meg snaps. She's sent to juvenile detention and comes back changed, hardened, wiser. She doesn't whimper anymore, doesn't plead for affection. Instead, she stares straight ahead with a cold, quiet calm. It's the first time we see her reclaim power, not as a punchline, but as a presence. The family doesn't know how to handle it. Peter tries to belittle her. Lois tries to reason with her. But Meg isn't playing their game anymore. She's rewritten the rules. And even though the episode ends with a return to the status quo, something lingers in the air. A reminder that Meg isn't as harmless as she once seemed. It's not that she's vengeful, not exactly. It's that she knows now. She knows what they are. She knows what she is. And that knowledge shifts the balance. Because there's one thing the Griffins never prepare for: a Meg who no longer needs them. This shift appears in subtle moments throughout the series. Little flashes of defiance. A raised eyebrow when Lois talks down to her. A deadpan joke delivered without flinching. A quiet refusal to engage in her family's chaos. She's not fighting for space anymore. She's claiming it. On her terms. And when you start to notice it, you can't unsee it. Suddenly, Meg isn't just the awkward girl in the corner. She's the only character in the room who's listening. She's the only one who knows the full picture. And because she isn't constantly talking, she's learning about who her family really is, about how people reveal themselves when they think you don't matter, about how to move quietly and still be felt. This quiet evolution doesn't make her loud. It makes her undeniable. She starts to play along less, laugh less. Her jokes land heavier, with more weight behind them. Her eyes don't dart around nervously anymore. They lock in, still soft, still hopeful in some small corner of her, but no longer pleading. There's a resilience to her that wasn't there before. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that doesn't seek applause. The kind that says, I know who I am, even if you never will. And that's when Meg becomes something more than a forgotten daughter or a running gag. She becomes real. Because reality, unlike comedy, doesn't need a punchline. It just needs presence. Meg has always had presence. She's always been there, frame after frame, scene after scene. But now she's taking control of how she occupies that space. Not with noise, not with drama, with intention. With truth. And in that truth, she starts to shine in a way her family can't comprehend. Because they're still playing characters. Still hiding behind quirks and catchphrases. Still clinging to their exaggerated roles. But Meg, she's dropped the mask. She doesn't need one anymore, because invisibility gave her something none of them have. Perspective. She can see the flaws in the game, the cycles, the lies. She knows when Peter is pretending. She sees when Lois is stretched too thin to parent. She understands Chris's quiet pain. She recognizes Stewie's fear beneath his bravado. And she knows how to stand quietly beside all of it. Not with judgment, but with awareness. That's the gift of being overlooked. You get to choose how you respond. And Meg, despite everything, is still choosing kindness. Not the soft, naive kind, but the kind that's born from pain, from seeing the worst in people and still offering a hand, from being ignored and still choosing to show up, from living in the margins and still refusing to disappear. That is Meg's quiet rebellion. Not rage, not revenge. Resilience. She becomes a presence that doesn't need acknowledgement to be felt. And in doing so, she shifts the gravity of the show. The more we see her this way, the more Family Guy becomes a story not about Peter's antics or Stewie's plans, but about a girl growing stronger in silence, a girl who endures. And eventually, we begin to understand what Meg has known all along, that survival isn't passive. It's not waiting. It's a choice. Every day, a decision to keep going even when no one sees you, especially when no one sees you. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody's watching, because they're watching everyone else. Meg's invisibility isn't just a shield, it's a mirror. It reflects back the hidden truths of those around her. And the more we linger in her silence, the more we start to see the dysfunction of the Griffin family, not through cutaway gags or punchlines, but through the eyes of a daughter quietly waiting for someone to notice her pain. She's watched Peter fail time and again at being a father, watched him belittle her, use her, forget her name, yet she still says Dad with something close to hope in her voice. Watched Lois shower Chris and Stewie with attention, only to give Meg the scraps. And still, Meg shows up at the dinner table, shows up at school, shows up in the background of every frame, hoping for something better. And every time she's disappointed, she doesn't shatter. She recalibrates. She survives. And in that survival is a deep kind of grace. There's no screaming breakdown, no dramatic departure, just a girl learning how to live with the quiet ache of being unseen and choosing, in spite of it, to keep going. She builds her own world, her own identity. Not loud, not glamorous, but real. And slowly, piece by piece, she stops asking for acceptance from the family who refuses to give it. She starts making space for her own sense of self, however clumsy or uncertain it may be. Because when you spent your whole life being told who you are, you eventually start asking harder questions. What if they're wrong? What if I'm not pathetic? What if I'm not a joke? What if I matter, even if no one says it out loud? And it's there, in those private moments of reflection, that Meg Griffin becomes something more than a stereotype. She becomes a survivor of her own narrative. Someone who wasn't handed kindness, but still chooses not to be cruel. Someone who wasn't given support, but still chooses not to give up. Someone who wasn't seen, but still sees. There's a scene that rarely gets mentioned. It's not flashy, not funny. Meg sits alone in her room, headphones on, doodling in her notebook. It's a quiet moment, but if you pause, if you really look, you'll see it. Peace. Just for a second. A flicker of calm in the chaos. Not because anything got better. Not because anyone apologized. But because Meg has learned the hardest lesson of all. That peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you build silently, in the shadows of being ignored. And this is quiet strength. This is what makes Meg Griffin the emotional heartbeat of Family Guy. She's not just the awkward teenager. She's the emotional counterweight. The reminder that even in a world full of noise, someone is listening. Even in a family full of chaos, someone is absorbing it all. Even in a show built on absurdity, someone still feels. Meg Griffin is that someone. And once you see her this way, you realize she always was. From the beginning, she was the tether, the stillness, the steady presence, waiting patiently at the dinner table, sitting quietly into the car, offering an idea, a concern, a piece of herself, only to be mocked or ignored. And still she stays. Not because she has no choice, but because she chooses to. That's strength. And that's power. Not the kind that demands attention. The kind that doesn't need it. She becomes a lesson, not just in surviving neglect, but in refusing to let it define her. A quiet lesson. One that unfolds slowly. One that most people miss. But once you catch it, once you start seeing her clearly, you begin to realize something deeply important. Meg Griffin was never the joke. The joke was how long it took us to notice. Because there's something tragic and oddly beautiful about watching someone stand so still that the world forgets they're there. And yet they remain. Meg is the girl who wasn't there. And that, in the end, is what makes her unforgettable. Sometimes loneliness doesn't scream, it hums. It's in the soft thump of music playing behind a locked door. It's in the pencil tapping against a notebook during study hall. It's in the way a phone lights up, not from someone calling, but from the hope that maybe someone might. And that's where we find Meg now. Away from the Griffin kitchen. Away from the shrieking laughter and the barrage of insults. Here in the shadowy corridors of James Woods Regional High, Meg Griffin walks the halls like a ghost with a schedule. Not hated, not feared, just forgotten. Teachers barely glance up when they mark attendance. Classmates pass her like furniture. When her name is called in group projects, it's not with excitement. It's with the resigned tone of someone being handed the leftover piece of the puzzle. And yet, Meg tries. She sharpens her pencils. She takes notes. She raises her hand even when the words tremble on her lips. She shows up. Because even when the world offers you silence, there's something brave about refusing to disappear. But there's a price. Because this isn't just a sitcom high school with zany lockers and hallway brawls. This is where Meg's wounds stretch beyond her home into a different kind of battlefield. The hierarchy here is razor sharp, and Meg is always at the bottom. She's the target of whispered jokes, cruel pranks, anonymous texts. Her lunch tray gets knocked to the floor more often than not. Her crushes never materialize into anything more than one-sided longing. When she asks someone to a dance, the laughter echoes louder than the music ever would have. It would be easy, so easy, to break under that kind of constant, quiet rejection. But Meg doesn't. She adapts. And that's when something subtle starts to happen. In the margins of her notebooks, we begin to see strange little drawings. Not just doodles, scenes, a fantasy life, characters that look vaguely like her, but bolder, louder, freer. Her art becomes her refuge. She creates stories where she's the hero. Stories where the guy likes her back, where the joke lands in her favor, where she isn't the invisible echo in the room, but the voice everyone leans in to hear. In these pages, Meg breathes. It's in the quiet that we see who she really is, not the clumsy, socially awkward sidekick the show often presents, but a complicated, creative, emotionally rich teenager trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make space for her. And there are glimmers, tiny ones, of light. A passing teacher who compliments her sketch. A book report that earns a rare A. A substitute art instructor who says, "You've got something in you. Don't let them dull it." Meg carries those moments like fireflies in a jar. Small, glowing, flickering against the dark. They aren't enough to banish the shadows, but they exist. And that's enough for now. But Meg's search for something real doesn't stop at notebooks and hallway stairs. Because inside her is a hunger. Not just for attention. Not even for love. But for recognition. To be seen. To be heard. To be understood in a way that doesn't turn into a punchline. And so she tries. Again and again. Clubs. Crushes. Cafeteria tables where she tries to wedge herself in before getting up silently and finding the corner. There's a painful sort of hope in these moments. The kind that says, maybe this time. And when it doesn't happen, she doesn't scream. She tucks it away. But we see it. The way she lingers just a second longer than she needs to. The way she laughs a little too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, just to feel included. The way her eyes flicker when someone calls her name without venom. She's not desperate. She's starved. And that starvation isn't just social, it's emotional, existential. She wants to belong, but more than that, she wants to matter. And that search carries her into unexpected places, into moments where the absurdity of Family Guy collides with her genuine ache for connection. She tries to become something she's not. Goth, preppy, punk, hoping one of the skins will stick. She dates guys who are wildly wrong for her because wrong attention still feels like something. She even joins cults, fakes confidence, reinvents her name, invents whole personalities, anything that might shake her loose from the grip of being overlooked. But none of it lasts, because it's not the world Meg wants to escape. It's a mirror. The one that tells her she's only visible when distorted, only lovable when exaggerated, only were they were pretending. And that's when it hits her. If she has to become someone else just to be loved, is it really love at all? That question sits with her. In the dark. In her room. In the pauses between family dinners and missed text messages. And in that silence, a new thought begins to form. Maybe the real power isn't in being loved by others. Maybe it's in loving herself, quietly, stubbornly, defiantly. Maybe the thing she's searching for outside, the approval, the belonging, the identity, has to start from within. It doesn't mean the hurt stops. It doesn't mean the hallway laughs fade or the Griffin house becomes a safe haven. But it does mean that Meg starts seeing herself a little differently. Not as broken, not as pathetic, but as someone worth fighting for. And that's the quiet revolution of Meg Griffin. Not the fight for attention, but the fight to keep being herself even when no one else thinks she should. There's something deeply human in continuing to show up for a world that refuses to notice you. That's Meg Griffin's quiet legacy. And while her family may serve as the center stage of comedic chaos, it's her time alone. Those unscripted corners of the day where her real story plays out. Take, for instance, the public library. It's quiet there. Not sitcom quiet, but heavy, dust-suspended quiet. The kind where the turning of a page becomes a heartbeat and every movement feels like it matters. That's where Meg goes when she needs to breathe. She doesn't just browse the teen fiction shelf or camp near the Wi-Fi, like most kids her age. She finds the aisle no one else walks down. The one with battered psychology books, journals, and tattered anthologies of poetry. Because even if no one listens at home, the words in those books always do. She reads about self-worth, about identity, about the invisible labor of simply existing when the world doesn't see you. And in those margins, sometimes literally, she scribbles her own voice. Little notes to herself. You felt that too. You're not alone. This made you cry for a reason. They're not declarations of rebellion. They're reminders that she's still here, still reaching, still feeling. And that matters. But one day, in that quiet corner of the library, something different happens. She notices a name scribbled in the same book she's been annotating. A stranger's note. A different handwriting, a different shade of ink, but responding to her thoughts. Like a conversation across time. Meg freezes. For a moment, it feels like someone's reached through the pages and seen her. Truly seen her. Week after week, they trade notes in the margins. They never meet, never speak. But the dialogue grows. One day, the stranger writes, I'm glad you're here. I thought I was the only one. Meg's throat tightens. Not from sadness, but from the strange, radiant bloom of being understood. This connection, however anonymous, gives her something her daily life never has. Reflection without mockery. Affection without strings. A moment where her thoughts are valued, not laughed at. It's subtle. But it changes her. She begins to sit straighter in class, answers a little more confidently. Even her wardrobe shifts, not to please anyone else, but to mirror who she feels like that day. She's not trying to disappear anymore. She's trying to exist on purpose. It's quiet rebellion, but it echoes in unexpected places. At school, someone compliments her shoes. At home, Lois accidentally eats a sandwich Meg made, thinking it was hers. She likes it. Doesn't insult it. Just likes it. Small things. Inconsequential, maybe. But to Meg, they're shocks to the system. Moments where the world doesn't reject her by default. And in those moments, something dangerous happens. Hope. But hope is a double-edged blade for someone like Meg, because hope means vulnerability. And vulnerability in Quahog often ends in humiliation. She confides in someone she thinks is a friend, about the book margins, about the person she's never met but feels close to. She shares this sliver of her secret world. And the next day, photocopies of the annotations are posted on lockers like a scavenger hunt of her inner life, her feelings dissected, her words mocked. The laughter returns, sharper this time, more personal. Because now they're not laughing at Meg the joke. They're laughing at Meg the heart. And that cuts deeper. She rips the pages out of the book, tears up her notes, doesn't go to the library for a week. When she returns, it's different. The air heavier, the shadows longer. But the book is still there. And so is a new message. I'm still here if you are. She doesn't cry. Not then. But she runs her fingers over the words like they're a lifeline. Because they are. Not because this stranger is a savior. Not because this connection fixes anything. But because it reminds her that despite everything, despite the mockery, the betrayal, the crushing loneliness, there is still someone listening. Even if it's just in ink. Even if it's only for a few more pages. Meg begins to understand something quietly revolutionary. Connection doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be true. And truth for someone like her is a radical act. So she keeps writing. In different books now. In the backs of library checkout slips. In her own journal tucked inside her pillowcase. Because even if the world refuses to hold space for her, she can. She can build her own echo chamber. One where her voice isn't mocked or flattened, but magnified. Where her pain becomes poetry. Her rejection becomes rhythm. And her silence becomes symphony. This evolution isn't obvious. She still gets ignored at family dinners. Still gets blamed for things she didn't do. Still walks hallways where her name is more insult than identity. But she's changing. Not louder, not tougher. Just more real. More Meg. And that's when we start to see it. The quiet danger of a girl who refuses to vanish. The danger of a girl who refuses to vanish isn't in her defiance or even in her strength. It's in her persistence. Because Meg Griffin doesn't scream back. She doesn't punch harder. She doesn't storm out with a middle finger to the sky. She does something far more unsettling. She endures. And with every act of quiet endurance, she becomes something the world around her can't define, can't reduce to a punchline. Because what if the joke was never funny? What if the silence she swallowed all her life has begun to take shape? Something sharper, something heavier, something that watches back. That's where Meg begins to live, in the cracks between ridicule and revelation. In those places where the laugh track fades and all that remains is a heartbeat and a thought she isn't afraid to finish anymore. It starts with the mirror. For years, it was her enemy. Not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. She didn't see the girl the magazines promised. Didn't see the filtered softness, the glowing skin, the twinkling eyes and airbrushed lips. She saw a face that others called plain. Hair they called limp. A body that drew snickers when she passed the table in the cafeteria. But something shifted. Now she looks longer. And instead of editing her reflection, she studies it. There's a fierceness in her eyebrows, a defiance in her jawline, a tiredness in her eyes that says, I've seen worse days, and I'm still here. She starts brushing her hair, not to impress, but to care. Applies chapstick, not for beauty, but as ritual. As a declaration that her lips do deserve softness. Her clothes shift, too, not toward fashion trends, but toward something that fits the shape of her mood, not her shame. Flannel when she wants to disappear. A red hoodie when she wants to feel anchored. Black when the world feels too colorful to bear. It's not style. It's armor. Meg has no illusions about becoming popular. She's not expecting a makeover montage and a prom queen crown. But the thing is, she doesn't need the crowd's validation anymore. She just needs her own. So she cultivates solitude like a greenhouse, tends to it, waters it with music and books and thoughts she doesn't share. And slowly from that soil, something strange grows. Curiosity. Not about how others see her, but about who she might become if she stopped apologizing for existing. She starts journaling again, not as a diary, but as an experiment. Each entry a dissection of the day. How she felt. What she didn't say. What she wished she had. And through it all, a pattern forms. Not of weakness, but of containment. So much of Meg's life has been a kind of emotional duct tape, holding back floods of thoughts, holding together fragments of identity, keeping herself from breaking in front of people who wouldn't notice if she did. But the journal doesn't need her to hold it in. The pages are patient. The ink doesn't flinch. And so she spills. About her loneliness. About how some days, even her heartbeat feels like it's happening in someone else's body. About how she's memorized the sounds of her house, the way Peter laughs when he thinks of something crude, the way Stewie's voice sharpens when no one's looking, the silence Lois uses as a weapon. She writes about how even Brian, the one family member who occasionally tossed her a crumb of compassion, ultimately abandoned her for girls who didn't carry the weight of being a Griffin. It's not rage she feels. It's erosion. The slow scraping away of self until there's nothing left but an outline. But writing helps redraw the lines. Helps remind her that she exists inside them. Still, something remains missing. Not attention. Not fame. But witness. The human ache to be seen in totality, and not just in moments of failure. One night, she tries something new. She records a voice memo on her phone. Just a few words. Her thoughts about the day. What she noticed. What she pretended not to care about. And then she deletes it. Not because she's ashamed, but because saying it, hearing herself say it, was enough. It was proof. Proof that she had a voice, even if no one else was listening. And over time, those recordings become a ritual. She doesn't save them, doesn't post them, doesn't seek an audience. She just says the things out loud that no one's ever made space for. And with each word, her room becomes a little less haunted. Because Meg isn't haunted by ghosts. She's haunted by the living. By the absence of care, the passive cruelties, the constant reminders that love in this household comes with conditions she can't meet. But when she speaks, when she narrates her thoughts, even into a void, she reclaims her own narrative. She's no longer the character being written. She's the one holding the pen. There's something chilling about that. Not in a horror sense, but in the quiet realization that all this time, Meg Griffin has been building a life inside herself. A parallel world. Not to escape into, but to grow from. And maybe that's the most dangerous kind of strength. The kind no one sees coming. Because while her family bickers and fights and forgets she's in the room, Meg is changing. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And when clarity takes root in a soul that's been starved for so long, it doesn't bloom. It erupts. So much of Meg's life has felt like holding her breath underwater, waiting for someone to notice she's been submerged this whole time. But lately, there's a new stillness to her. Not the frozen stillness of someone waiting for rescue, but the calm of someone who's learned to breathe beneath the surface. And it's in that stillness that something profound begins to settle. A sense of choice. For the first time in her life, Meg doesn't feel like a permanent passenger in someone else's chaos. She starts to make small decisions, not reactive, not desperate, but deliberate, intentional. Like waking up 10 minutes earlier, not to impress, but to sit in silence before the noise starts. Like making tea instead of coffee, not because it's trendy, but because she likes the quiet way the steam curls from the cup. Like taking walks without headphones, letting the world exist around her without trying to drown it out. She finds beauty in unnoticed things, cracks in the pavement that form quiet constellations, the way sunlight flickers through the broken blinds of her window, the steady rhythm of her own footsteps. In these moments, Meg is not mocked, not pitied, not dismissed. She simply is. And that, in itself, is revolutionary. But the world hasn't changed. Quahog still groans with the same weight. The Griffins are still the Griffins, chaotic, self-absorbed, and unchanging. Peter is still loud, still vulgar, still incapable of thinking beyond his next beer or joke. Lois remains poised and cold, wielding her maternal role like a knife that slices Meg out of every family photo, emotionally, if not physically. Chris drifts through life like a helium balloon tied too loosely to reality. Even he, the brother closest to her in age, feels oceans away in awareness. And Stewie? Brilliant, psychotic, hilarious. He continues to craft elaborate schemes and speak with Shakespearean disdain. Occasionally he throws Meg a glance, one that almost recognizes her as sentient. Almost. But no one asks how she's doing. No one notices that her eyes linger longer on sunsets now. No one sees that her posture has shifted, no longer stooped in self-preservation, but lifted in quiet defiance. And maybe that's okay, because recognition was never the goal. Reclamation was. She's no longer waiting for them to see her. She's busy seeing herself. That shift is subtle. It doesn't come with a montage or music swelling in the background. It comes with habits, with boundaries, with silence that feels chosen, not imposed. At school, Meg no longer forces laughter at other people's jokes. She stops trying to be part of conversations that always made her feel smaller. She doesn't sit with the popular kids hoping to be noticed. She sits under the tree near the science building and reads, or just stares at the clouds. And people notice. Not in the dramatic movie-style turnaround kind of way, but in whispers, in glances. Some of the other students, those on the edges, the loners and quiet ones, start nodding at her in the hallway. Not out of pity, but recognition. As if to say, you're not invisible. You're one of us. And that nod feels more real than any forced attention ever did. She's not building popularity. She's building authenticity. Even in her home, small shifts begin to show. When Peter makes a lazy joke at her expense, she doesn't laugh awkwardly. She just leaves the room. When Lois forgets to buy something Meg asked for, Meg doesn't remind her with a passive-aggressive sigh. She just buys it herself. When Stewie tells her to shut up, she doesn't argue. She just stares at him, long enough for him to feel uncomfortable. Power for Meg isn't about volume. It's about presence. And her presence is growing. Not as an echo, but as a force. She starts spending more time outside, not to escape, but to connect. The stars feel like a private audience. The wind a conversation partner more honest than anyone in her household. She speaks less, but when she does, her words are heavier. Considered, measured. And people start to respond differently. There's a teacher, Mr. Delaney, English Lit. He's the first adult in a long time who doesn't treat her like background noise. One day after class, he compliments her essay on Sylvia Plath. Says it was insightful. Says it made him think. She doesn't know how to respond, so she just nods. But when she gets home, she rereads that essay. And for the first time, she sees what he saw. Clarity. Not pain for the sake of drama, but understanding. There's a depth in Meg that no one ever took the time to dive into. But she's learning how to swim in it herself. And in that sea of self-awareness, she starts asking questions she never dared before. What do I want? What would my life look like if I wasn't always anticipating rejection? Who am I outside of how they define me? Those questions don't have neat answers, but they open doors, possibilities. Dreams she buried beneath cynicism start to rise. Maybe she could write. Maybe she could study psychology, not to fix others, but to understand why people hurt without noticing. Maybe she could leave Quahog one day. Not in a blaze of fury, but in quiet triumph, rather. She doesn't need them to cheer for her. She just needs to find the place where her silence becomes song. The place where she can walk into a room and not brace for impact. The place where she can just be Meg. Not a punchline, not a burden, not a background character, but the main event of her own life. And slowly, chapter by chapter, she begins writing that story, not with grand gestures, but with consistent truth. Because in a world that tried so hard to make her feel small, Meg Griffin is building a sanctuary that can't be touched by ridicule. And in that sanctuary, she's not just surviving. She's becoming. But self-discovery isn't a straight line. Growth doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it's as uncomfortable as it is liberating. And for Meg, learning to see herself clearly also means facing the shadows she's spent years trying to ignore. Because there's grief in waking up. Grief for the years spent apologizing for existing. Grief for the friendships that never were. The embraces she never received. The birthday wishes that felt like formalities. The family dinners where she was more a fixture than a participant. And that grief doesn't knock on the door politely. It floods in during the quietest moments. At night, when the house falls asleep under the weight of its own chaos, Meg lies awake and listens to the silence. It's not peaceful. It hums with what was never said, never acknowledged. She thinks about the time she cried in the school bathroom and wiped her tears quickly so no one would see. About the way her voice used to tremble when she answered in class, afraid of being mocked. About how, even now, a compliment makes her tense, because part of her expects the punchline to follow. This kind of sadness isn't loud. It's subtle, lingering. Like the feeling of returning to a room and realizing someone's moved your things. It's the ache of absence. But she lets herself feel it now, all of it. Not because because she enjoys the pain, but because she finally understands that denying it never made it go away. There's healing in recognition. And that healing, though slow, begins to weave itself into her daily rhythm. Some mornings are easier than others. Some days she still flinches when Peter's laughter carries from the living room, half expecting her name to be the punchline. Some evenings, she still hesitates at dinner, unsure whether anyone will notice if she speaks. But now the hesitation is followed by something new, a choice. She can retreat or she can reclaim space. More often now, she chooses the latter. Not dramatically, not to provoke, but to assert something soft, yet powerful. I belong here too. And bit by bit, the world responds. Not always kindly, not always consistently. But sometimes, someone listens. At school, her literature teacher starts asking for her opinions more regularly. Not just about assigned readings, but about life, philosophy, emotion. There's a moment when Meg makes a quiet observation about how Holden Caulfield wasn't just cynical, he was scared. Scared of vulnerability, of becoming what he hated. And Mr. Delaney just nods, not in a condescending way, but in the way someone nods when they feel seen by what you said. It stays with her for days. At lunch, she sits alone, but it doesn't feel lonely anymore. It feels like solitude, chosen and peaceful. Sometimes other students pass by and glance her way. Some look curious, some indifferent. A few smile. And one afternoon, someone sits beside her. A girl from art class. Julia, quiet, always drawing, headphones in. They don't talk at first, just share the space. And that's enough. By the end of the week, Julia starts sharing her sketches. By the end of the month, they're trading stories. Not dramatic ones, just pieces of their days. And slowly Meg's world expands. It's not a revolution. It's an evolution. Her room starts to change too. She takes down the posters she put up in middle school because she thought they'd make her likable. She replaces them with things that feel real. A dried flower from a walk. A small framed quote she wrote herself. Books stacked in uneven towers, not for show, but for comfort. Even the mirror feels different. She doesn't look into it with judgment anymore. She looks to understand. There are still days she doesn't like what she sees. Days the old voices creep back in, telling her she's not enough, not pretty, not interesting, not wanted. But those voices aren't as loud now. And they don't go unchallenged. Because now, Meg has her own voice. A quieter one, yes, but steady, grounded, rooted in truth. She's learning to separate the reflection from the projection. Learning that her worth isn't dictated by Peter's jokes or Lois's silence. That her story doesn't need external validation to matter. And that realization begins to reflect in her presence. When she walks through the hallway at school, her gaze is no longer downcast. When someone makes a snide remark, she doesn't flinch. She meets their eyes. When her family dismisses her in conversation, she doesn't retreat. She speaks again. Not louder, just clearer. And even when they don't listen, she hears herself. That, she's learning, is more important. Because at the end of the day, the world may never fully understand Meg Griffin. Her family may never change. Her school may never offer her a stage. The town of Quahog may always see her as the background character, the blurry outline in a chaotic painting. But Meg, she's starting to see herself in full resolution. And that clarity is worth everything. Even if no one else claps. Even if the applause never comes. Because there is peace in knowing that you are not invisible to yourself. There is strength in holding your own gaze, and there is power in the quiet act of becoming, especially when the world insists you never could. It's strange how quietly a revolution can unfold. There are no parades, no fireworks, just a subtle shifting of the ground beneath your feet, so subtle that most people don't even notice. But you do, because the world feels slightly less heavy when you stand a little taller. And Meg Griffin is standing taller now. It's not always obvious. The change is quiet, like a soft hum beneath everything she does. But it's there, in the way she breathes through discomfort instead of shrinking from it, in the way she smiles at her reflection even when the day has been unkind. It shows in her conversations, too. She's not trying to impress anyone anymore. She's just being. And that authenticity begins to ripple outward. Julia, her quiet lunch companion, notices it. She tells Meg one afternoon, "You're different now. I mean, you've always been cool, but you seem more grounded." Meg blushes. She's not used to compliments that don't have a second edge. "Thanks," she says, unsure how to receive something that feels so genuine. But she holds onto it like a smooth stone in her pocket. Others start noticing too. Not because Meg is doing anything grand. She's not performing. She's not shouting to be seen. But because she's stopped hiding. It's funny. Once you stop apologizing for existing, people start treating you like you do. Not everyone, of course. There are still cruel kids in the hallway. Still teachers who forget her name. Still family dinners where her words are talked over or ignored. But they don't pierce the same way they used to. Because Meg has found something more important than their approval, her voice. And that voice, though quiet, is learning how to carry. She starts writing more, journals filled with thoughts, sketches, fragments of poems. Some messy, some sharp, all hers. She's not writing for school, not for likes, not even for anyone to read. She's writing to exist. To give shape to feelings she spent years compressing. To build a world where she can breathe fully. One evening, she's sitting in her room, reading back through one of her notebooks. She pauses on a line she doesn't remember writing. Maybe I was never invisible. Maybe I was just surrounded by people who didn't know how to see. She closes the book slowly, heart thudding, the words settling over her like a soft blanket. She doesn't need to be seen by everyone, just by herself. And for the first time, that feels like enough. It's not that she's giving up on others, it's that she's stopped waiting for them to give her permission to be whole. And with that release comes a kind of lightness, a quiet joy, not loud or performative, just real. One night, as she's brushing her teeth, Lois knocks on the bathroom door. Meg opens it, toothbrush in hand. Lois pauses. "You, going out tomorrow?" Meg blinks, surprised. "I'm meeting Julia. Why?" Lois shrugs. "Just asking. You seem busy lately." It's not an apology, it's not affection, but it's something. And it makes Meg realize how far she's come. Not just in how others see her, but in how she sees these moments. She doesn't need more than what they can give. She's learned to find her own sustenance. She nods. "Yeah, I've got plans." Lois just says, "Okay," and walks away. And Meg smiles. Not because the moment was warm, but because she didn't shrink herself to make it comfortable. Later that weekend, she and Julia go to a used bookstore downtown. The kind with creaky floors and shelves that seem to grow like vines. They get coffee and talk about nothing in particular. It's not dramatic, but it feels like belonging. And that's something Meg's never had on her own terms. They flip through old comic books. Julia finds a copy of a surreal indie graphic novel and insists Meg reads it. Meg buys it on a whim. That night, she stays up reading it by the glow of her bedside lamp. The story is strange and melancholy. A tale about a girl who turns into a shadow, wandering through a city of forgotten things. But it's beautiful, haunting. And something about it speaks to her. There's a panel near the end where the shadow girl standing at the edge of the city says, "I was never lost. I was just waiting for the silence to echo back." Meg closes the book and breathes in deep. There's something comforting about knowing that even fictional shadows can find meaning. That even in stories where characters vanish, there's still a heartbeat, a presence. Because for so long, that's how she felt. Like a background noise in someone else's life. But not anymore. The transformation is slow, ongoing. And there are still stumbles. Still days when the weight returns unexpectedly. Still mornings when her confidence slips through her fingers like water. But even then, she knows she's not back at the beginning. Because now she has memory. Memory of strength, of kindness, of choosing herself. Of sitting beside someone who saw her and didn't flinch. Of writing words that felt like truth. Of waking up and not dreading the mirror. Of reclaiming space. Not just in the world, but in her own mind. These memories build a foundation. And foundations, even when cracked, hold. Meg Griffin, the invisible girl, is no longer trying to disappear. She's not waiting to be chosen. Not hoping to be rescued. She is becoming. And that becoming isn't always graceful. It's messy and uneven, but it's hers. And every step forward, no matter how small, is a rebellion. Against the narrative she was handed. Against the silence she was buried under. Against the idea that her worth had to be proven. She no longer wants to be a version of someone else's comfort. She wants to be Meg. Not Meg the joke. Not Meg the mistake. Just Meg. In her own rhythm. Her own color. Her own voice. Change rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest ways. A slower blink in the mirror. A gentler voice in your head. A sigh that doesn't carry as much weight. For Meg, the change continues quietly. Not a revolution. Not a loud defiance. Just a soft unfolding. She started walking home from school instead of taking the bus. It gives her time to breathe, to think, to not be surrounded by noise. The sidewalks are cracked, and the wind is usually indifferent. But there's something in that space that feels like hers. She stops by a park sometimes, watches the trees shuffle their tired summer leaves. She brings her journal and scribbles down fragments of thought. Sometimes full pages, other times just a sentence. Sometimes she writes things she doesn't even understand yet. Like, "I'm not angry at them anymore. I'm just done asking to be seen." Or, "Even shadows are evidence of light." They're not poems. Not really. They're small markers, emotional breadcrumbs. A way to track her own heartbeat through the fog. And they help. The thing is, Meg isn't chasing transformation for someone else's benefit. She's not hoping Peter or Lois or even Stewie will finally get it. She's learning to live without that validation. One afternoon, she walks past a group of girls she used to desperately want to impress. They're laughing, scrolling through photos, and one of them says, "Remember when Meg tried to join the dance team?" Oof. Meg hears it. Every word. But she doesn't stop. Doesn't turn around. Instead, she keeps walking, steady, calm, letting their laughter pass through her like wind through branches. It stings, yes, but it doesn't collapse her. Because their approval isn't currency she needs anymore. Later that night, as she's lying in bed, she thinks about how long she spent chasing spaces that were never made for her. Friendships where she was a prop. Rooms where she had to shrink herself just to fit in the frame. Now she's building her own spaces. And even if they're small, even if they're quiet, they're hers. She started experimenting with her clothes again. Nothing radical, just small changes. A new jacket she thrifted. Earrings she made herself. She no longer dresses to disappear. She dresses to feel like herself. Sometimes she gets weird looks. Sometimes her mom raises an eyebrow. But it doesn't derail her. Because Meg is finally asking herself, what do I like? What feels like me? She plays music while she gets ready. Not to impress, just to set a tone, a soundtrack to her own presence. And one morning, something unexpected happens. She walks into school and someone, not a close friend, just a classmate named Ezra, says, "Hey, that color looks good on you." Meg blinks. "Thanks," she says, trying not to sound shocked. He shrugs. "It's just cool. You're like, I don't know. You seem more confident lately." That word, confident, lands softly, like a feather drifting down. Meg doesn't respond right away, but inside something lights up. Later, she writes in her notebook. Confidence isn't loud. Sometimes it just means walking into a room and not flinching. She's learning that confidence doesn't require permission. It doesn't need an audience. It's not a costume you put on for others. It's a seed you water privately until it grows. At home, things haven't changed much. The family still forgets she's in the room. Jokes still land at her expense. Peter still calls her Meg with that nasal groan. But her reaction has changed. She doesn't internalize it the way she used to. She sees it for what it is, noise. And when your inner world grows rich, outside noise starts to matter less. One weekend, Stewie barges into her room, as he often does. He's wearing some bizarre, futuristic contraption and says, "I need your closet for a secret portal to the dystopian timeline. Move." Meg doesn't move. She simply says no. Stewie freezes. "What?" "I said no," she repeats, calm but firm. There's a long silence. Then Stewie blinks and slowly backs out, muttering something about unexpected resistance from irrelevant parties. Meg closes her door and smiles to herself. It's a small victory, but it's hers. And it tells her something powerful. Boundaries aren't loud either. Sometimes they're just the word no. Held gently but firmly, like a closed gate you no longer apologize for locking. She gets better at saying no. No to things that drain her. No to people who only call when they need something. No to that voice in her head that still tries to tell her she's not enough. She's not perfect. She still has bad days. Days when she spirals. Days when she doubts. But now those days don't define her. They're just weather, passing clouds. And she's learning how to sit through the storms without losing herself. On a quiet Wednesday evening, she and Julia sit in Meg's room surrounded by candles and snacks, playing a slow, dreamy playlist. They're not talking much, just being. At one point, Julia says, "I'm really glad we're friends." Meg looks up, startled. "Yeah, me too." Julia adds, "You've got a really calming energy, you know that?" Meg laughs. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Well, they should. You do. I feel safe around you." It's one of the most meaningful things Meg's ever heard. She writes it down that night, not as a quote, but as a feeling, a timestamp. proof that the person she's becoming is real to someone else, too. The girl who used to be a punchline now makes others feel safe. And somehow that feels like the biggest win of all. Sometimes purpose doesn't arrive with clarity. It creeps in like light under a door, slow, soft, unnoticed, until you're suddenly standing in it. For Meg, it starts with a flyer. She doesn't know what makes her stop in the school hallway that morning. Maybe it's the colors. Maybe it's the way the wind flutters the edge of the paper, beckoning her hand. Or maybe it's just instinct, a soft tug from somewhere inside. Peer mentors needed. Apply in room 114. Help others. Learn more about yourself. Meg stares at it for a moment. Her first impulse is to walk away. She imagines the voices already. You, a mentor? Who would listen to you? But she doesn't move. Instead, she takes the flyer, folds it slowly, slips it into her pocket. Like she's hiding a small seed, unsure if it will ever grow, but unwilling to let it blow away. That afternoon, she sits on her bed staring at the folded paper. She thinks about all the moments she wished someone had listened. All the years she waited for someone, anyone, to sit beside her and say, "You're not invisible. I see you." And maybe, just maybe, she could be that person for someone else. She shows up to room 114 the next day. There are only a few people, some younger students, a tired-looking teacher, and a girl named Karina who seems to radiate calm like sunlight through the glass. Karina smiles when Meg walks in. "Hey, you here for the mentor program?" Meg hesitates. Yeah, I think so." "Cool. We need more people who actually care." It's such a simple sentence, but it sits with Meg. People who actually care. She joins, quietly. No fanfare, no announcement. And for the first few meetings, she mostly listens. Watches how Karina handles the room. Sees how the younger students open up slowly, like flowers learning it's safe to bloom. It's awkward at first. Meg doesn't know what to say, but she listens. She realizes that listening, truly listening, is a gift most people don't offer. And one afternoon during a session, a freshman named Leah starts crying about her parents' divorce. The room goes silent. Everyone freezes. But Meg, without thinking, moves closer. Her voice is gentle. "That sucks. I'm sorry." Leah nods, wiping her nose. "It's just, I don't know how to be around both of them anymore." Meg thinks carefully, then says, "It's okay not to know. It doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." Leah blinks at her. Something shifts in her face. Relief, maybe. Or simply the comfort of not being alone. After the meeting, Karina walks over to Meg and says, "You have no idea how much that helped her." Meg shrugs. "I just said what I wish someone had said to me." Karina nods. "Exactly." Something settles inside Meg that night. Not pride, not ego. Just alignment. For once, her pain hasn't gone to waste. It has become a bridge for someone else. And that makes everything hurt a little less. She keeps going, every week, listening, helping, sitting in silence when silence is what's needed, offering soft advice when it feels right. She doesn't try to fix anyone, she just shows up. And people notice. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in the way they smile at her in the hallway, in the way Leah saves her a seat during lunch, in the way Karina leans on her when the group feels heavy. At home, things remain the same. Lois barely looks up from her phone. Chris is off in his own world. Stewie is, as always, plotting chaos. But Meg doesn't feel starved for their attention anymore. She's not building her sense of self inside that house. She's building it outside, in whispers, in warmth, in quiet acts of connection. And then, one evening, something unexpected happens. She gets a letter in her locker. It's handwritten. No name. Just a few lines. I don't know who you are, but you said something once about not needing other people's approval to feel real. That changed something for me. Thank you. Meg reads it twice. 3 times. Her hands tremble slightly as she folds it. She doesn't know who wrote it. But she carries the letter with her from that day forward. Because now she knows what she says, who she is, matters. Even if she doesn't always see it. Even if it echoes in quiet corners she may never visit. One Saturday, Karina invites her to help lead a peer support workshop at a local community center. Meg panics. Me? I don't know how to... You do, Karina interrupts. Just be yourself. So she goes, and she speaks. She talks about how it feels to be overlooked. To carry silence like a second skin. To live in the background for so long, you start believing that's where you belong. But she also talks about survival. About how kindness, especially toward yourself, is resistance. About how listening is a form of love. And the room listens. Really listens. She doesn't cry. She doesn't stumble. She just speaks. And after the workshop, a girl her age walks up and says, "Thank you. I've never heard anyone explain it like that. You made me feel less crazy." And that's when Meg realizes her voice, the one she used to hide, has power. Not the kind of power that shouts, not the kind that dominates, the kind that comforts, the kind that reaches out like a hand in the dark and says, "Come on, you're not alone." That night, as she lies in bed, she writes, "I used to think I was invisible. Now I think maybe I was just waiting to become someone worth seeing." She pauses, then crosses it out, and writes instead, "I was always someone worth seeing. They just didn't know how to look." The words on the page feel like an awakening. They aren't written for anyone else. They aren't meant to impress. They're simply Meg's truth, laid bare. And in the soft amber light of her bedroom, it feels revolutionary to see her own worth in her own handwriting. No validation needed. No applause required. The next morning, Meg walks through the school hallway differently. She doesn't puff up her chest. She doesn't wear anything flashy. But something about her presence has shifted. Like gravity has rebalanced slightly in her favor. She doesn't try to make eye contact with everyone. But she also doesn't look at the floor anymore. She just walks. And people notice. Some students who had never really spoken to her, maybe even ones who used to laugh behind her back, nod in passing. A quiet respect, not necessarily earned through popularity, but through presence, through this aura of having grown into herself. Even Coach, who had once forgotten her name, calls her Griffin, with something bordering on recognition. She doesn't need it, but she takes it. It's not a victory parade, it's a quiet acknowledgement that she's no longer walking through the world hoping to be seen. She sees herself now, and that changes everything. The mentor program continues to thrive. Meg finds herself not just attending, but facilitating. Karina, now prepping for graduation, slowly shifts more responsibility into Meg's hands. "You've got the heart for this," she says one day. "You don't try to fix people. You just sit with them in their mess. That's rare." Meg smiles a little shyly. "I guess I know what it's like to be messy." Karina laughs. "We all are. Some of us just hide it better." Meg starts crafting small lesson plans, discussion prompts, group check-ins, journaling exercises. It surprises her how natural it feels. She never considered herself a leader before. But here, among these quiet corners and vulnerable voices, she's beginning to understand that leadership doesn't always look like a loud voice or a commanding presence. Sometimes leadership is just creating space for others to breathe. And she loves it. At night, she journals more, long, sweeping entries about her thoughts, her fears, her quiet victories. Sometimes she writes letters she never sends, to her parents, to her younger self, even to Chris and Stewie, who remain locked in their own chaotic rhythms, largely unaware of the internal revolution happening in the room next door. She doesn't resent them anymore. Well, maybe a little, but not with the bitterness she used to carry. It's more like a quiet sadness, a mourning for the connection that could have been. But instead of chasing their attention, she focuses on building something real outside of that house, with the people who choose to see her. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, it happens. Principal Shepard stops her in the hallway. "Griffin," he says, adjusting his tie awkwardly. "You've been nominated for the Student Peer Leadership Award." Meg blinks. "What?" "It's real. You made an impression this year. Staff noticed, students noticed. Even the district's community program director mentioned you after the workshop." Meg stares at him. "I didn't even know that was a thing." He shrugs. "It is, and you're at the top of the list." She walks to class in a daze. Not because of the award, but because someone noticed. All of it. All the effort, the late nights, the emotional weight she carried to make space for others. It mattered. That night she lies awake, staring at the ceiling. Not dreaming of some shiny future or awards or applause, but just quietly holding on to the truth that she's become someone she's proud of. Someone who shows up. She doesn't tell her family, not out of spite, but because it's hers. This journey, this growth, it doesn't need to be filtered through their indifference. It stands on its own. But things begin to change, even at home, in subtle, fractured ways. Peter, half asleep on the couch one evening, mutters, "Did I hear something about you winning an award or something?" Meg hesitates. "Yeah, kind of." "Cool," he says, barely awake. "Good for you, Pumpkin." It's not much. But it's more than she ever got. Lois, upon seeing a letter from the school, offers a short, clipped congratulations. No hug, no genuine engagement. Just a tight smile. But Meg doesn't feel wounded. She used to crave their pride like air. Now she breathes on her own. One evening, Karina invites Meg to speak at a regional youth panel, something with actual press and real organizers. It's not just about the school, she explains. They're looking for stories about resilience, about how students are supporting each other. Meg's instincts to say no. But she doesn't. Instead, she says, "I'll think about it." She sits with it for a week, reads over the panel brief, imagines herself sitting in front of a microphone, a small crowd, cameras even. The fear is real. The self-doubt is louder than ever. But underneath it, something else pulses, something strong. She doesn't want to be famous. She doesn't want to be a spokesperson. She just wants to be honest. And if her story helps even one other invisible kid feel seen, isn't that worth the nerves? She agrees to speak. The night before the panel, she's pacing in her room, rehearsing lines, discarding half of them. Stewie, passing by the door, pokes his head in. Are you practicing for some sort of peasant gathering?" he snarks. Meg rolls her eyes. "It's a panel." "Ah, a festival of mediocrity. I shall alert the press." But as he walks away, he pauses, looks back. His voice softens, barely. "Knock 'em dead, Griffin." She almost says thank you. But instead she nods. It's enough. The next day, under the bright lights of the auditorium, Meg stands behind the podium. Her hands tremble at first, but her voice is steady. She speaks not about being a hero or overcoming all odds, but about being present. About the slow, steady journey of showing up for yourself when no one else does. About how every small act of care, every quiet listening moment, can shift the world for someone else. She talks about not needing permission to matter. And when she finishes, the applause is warm, not thunderous, but real. And in the audience, Karina is beaming. Leah is crying softly. Even one of her teachers is clapping with a kind of reverence Meg has never seen before. Backstage, someone hands her a small card. It's from another speaker, a boy named Evan, who says, "Your words reminded me why I chose this work. Thank you." Meg tucks the card into her bag beside the anonymous letter she still carries. 2 small pieces of paper. 2 echoes of the impact she didn't know she was capable of. When she gets home that evening, she places both letters on her nightstand. Next to them, she writes a new journal entry. "For the first time, I don't feel like I have to prove I exist. I just do. And that's enough." Meg's world doesn't change overnight. The day after the panel, she still wakes up in the same creaky bed, in the same house that forgets her name most days. The Griffin home hasn't shifted its gravity just because Meg did. But something inside her has. Something more enduring than applause or acknowledgement. It's the quiet strength of owning her space. She walks through the front door after school and no longer braces herself for silence or side eyes. She's not immune to the noise, but she no longer lets it write her identity. It floats past her now like static behind glass. That evening, she joins Karina for coffee. It's a rare moment outside the fluorescent school halls, a space where the boundaries between mentor and friend blur gently. "You were amazing on stage," Karina says, swirling her drink. Meg smiles, sipping her iced mocha. "I didn't black out, so I'll take the win." Karina laughs. "You didn't just survive. You spoke truth. And people felt it." Meg shrugs, trying not to let the pride show too visibly. It just felt good to say it out loud, like, for once, I wasn't choking on everything I'd been carrying. Karina looks at her thoughtfully. "You've come a long way, Meg. You know that, right?" And Meg nods, slow and certain. Yeah, I think I do." In the weeks that follow, Meg starts writing more publicly. She joins the school newsletter team, not for gossip or filler content, but to start a new column. Voices Between the Lines, a space for students to anonymously share their experiences, struggles, and victories. Meg curates, edits, sometimes adds her own reflections. It becomes wildly popular in a quiet way, passed around between classes, quoted in notebooks, even referenced by teachers in morning announcements. She doesn't put her name on it. Not at first. The point was never about credit. But eventually, people figure it out. And this time, she doesn't shrink from the attention. She meets new people. Students who once ignored her now approach her with a kind of reverent curiosity. Some want to write for the column. Some just want to talk. "Hey, I read that last one about feeling like a ghost in your own house," one girl says. "That was me. Like exactly me." Meg nods. "Yeah, it's more common than we think." In those moments, Meg feels like her invisibility has transformed into a superpower. Not because she disappeared, but because she learned how to see. She begins organizing weekly open mic circles in the school library. Not official events, but word spreads fast. People bring poetry, journals, songs, even sketches. Meg opens each session by reading something simple, honest, nothing dramatic. Just enough to crack open the door so others can walk through. One afternoon, during a particularly quiet session, someone new takes the mic. It's Neil Goldman. The room holds its breath. Neil, usually the butt of jokes, the forgotten extra in everyone's high school sitcom, clutches a crumpled sheet of paper. His voice shakes. This is something I wrote last week. I haven't really read it out loud. He takes a breath and begins. It's raw, awkward, heartbreaking, about loneliness and being the punchline and wishing someone would just listen. When he finishes, the room is still. Then someone claps. Then everyone. Meg watches from the back, eyes bright. Afterward, Neil walks over to her, still holding the paper like it might crumble. Thanks, he said, for this. I wouldn't have done it without, your stuff. She grins. You were brave. I just opened the door. It's in that moment that Meg understands something deeper, something that goes beyond the surface level wins. She's building a space where misfits, quiet kids, and invisible hearts can finally exist. Not just exist, but matter. And she's good at it. Her own therapist, whom she's still seeing weekly, points this out. You've stepped into a kind of leadership that isn't loud or commanding, the therapist says, legs crossed gently. It's emotional leadership, empathy-driven. That's a rare skill, especially in high school. Meg blushes. I don't know if I'd call it leadership. Then call it what you want. But it's powerful. At home, things remain the same, but her reaction to them doesn't. Chris bursts into her room one day, panicked about a sandwich he lost. Stewie storms in 2 nights later, demanding to borrow her eyeliner for an espionage performance piece. Peter forgets her birthday again. Lois asks if she can keep it down, while Meg is sobbing quietly over a poem she's trying to write. But instead of spiraling, Meg starts seeing them for what they are. Limited people, trapped in their own chaos. Their failure to nurture her isn't a reflection of her worth. She stops trying to earn their love like a trophy. She just lets it be. And in doing so, she becomes free. She spends weekends volunteering at a youth center downtown, a suggestion from Karina. It's underfunded and chaotic and full of kids who see through everything. But they like Meg. Because she listens. Because she never talks down. Because she's honest about her own cracks. One girl, maybe 11 years old, tugs at Meg's sleeve after a session. You remind me of a grown-up who never forgot being sad. Meg kneels down, eye level. That's because I haven't. The girl nods, solemn. That's a good kind of grown-up. It sticks with her for days. She writes the line down in her journal that night. Be the kind of grown-up who never forgets being sad. Her dreams begin to shift. It's no longer about escaping Quahog or reinventing herself in some shiny big city. It's about building spaces, safe ones, real ones. She begins researching social work programs, psychology, community organizing. She bookmarks colleges she once thought were out of reach. When the guidance counselor calls her in to discuss college plans, he's surprised. You've really, pulled your grades up. Meg nods. I started caring. He chuckles. That's half the battle. She doesn't expect a parade or even help, but she no longer sees the application process as a stretch. She belongs in that future just as much as anyone else. Her next piece for Voices Between the Lines is the most personal yet. She titles it On Growing in the Gaps. She writes about being the kid who went unnoticed, about how silence can be as loud as violence, about how sometimes the only person who can save you is you. She ends with this. We wait so long to be seen, but what if we start by seeing ourselves? What if we stop apologizing for taking up space? It circulates across the school like wildfire. And though Meg never signs her name, everyone knows. No one laughs. Not this time. They just nod. Because finally, Meg Griffin isn't a joke. She's a mirror. Meg never asked to be a symbol. That was never the plan. But as the school year draws deeper into spring, more and more people come to see her not as a mystery, not as a background character, but as someone real, not perfect, not polished, but present. And that presence changes things. It's not about popularity. Meg still walks alone sometimes, still eats lunch by herself when the day's been too loud, still has moments where she stares out a window and wonders if any of this will last. But what's changed is that now, when she's quiet, it's a choice, not an exile. And every now and then, someone will sit beside her, just to sit. Not to mock, not to make it weird, just to be near her stillness. Even the teachers have started to notice. One day in English class, Mr. West pauses while handing back essays. Meg, your piece on character arcs was excellent. The way you broke down emotional evolution. That was insightful. Meg blinks. Thanks. It's the first time a teacher has said her name with actual pride. Not confusion, not irritation, just recognition. She gets an A. And for the first time, it feels earned. After class, a classmate she barely knows, Jenna from the track team, leans in. I've been reading your column. You don't sign it, but it's obviously you. Meg freezes. Jenna continues. I just wanted to say it helped, like really helped. I didn't know anyone else felt that invisible sometimes. Meg smiles, small and real. You're not invisible. Jenna nods. Neither are you. Later that week, Meg is invited to speak at a local youth summit in Quahog, a small event hosted at the community center, mostly high school students and teachers from different parts of the city. Karina forwards her the invitation with a note. You in? Meg thinks about it. Part of her hesitates. Stage fright still lives in her spine. But the larger part of her, the version of her that showed up at the poetry panel, the version that has slowly unfurled across months of raw expression, says yes. The summit is on a Saturday afternoon. She wears her favorite hoodie and denim jacket. Nothing flashy. She wants to feel like herself. Her speech isn't perfect. She stumbles once. She loses her place. But when she talks about creating spaces where people can speak without fear, the room leans in. When she says, I used to feel like a character everyone hated in a show I didn't write, the silence is deep and understanding. When she finishes, people clap. Not politely, but genuinely. One boy in the back wipes his eyes. And for Meg, that's everything. Afterward, the organizer thanks her. You've got something, they say. You connect. Meg just nods, too overwhelmed to say much. Karina hugs her in the parking lot. I hope you know how proud I am of you. Meg hugs back. I didn't think I'd ever be proud of me. Karina pulls back. But you are? Meg nods. Yeah, I am. At home, life rolls on. Peter is still Peter. Lois still gives the lion's share of attention to Stewie and Chris. The dinner table is still chaos, but occasionally, Meg notices small shifts. Lois, one evening, knocks before entering Meg's room. Hey, just wanted to say I heard about your thing at the community center. That's pretty cool. Meg looks up from her notebook. Thanks. Lois lingers a moment, then adds, You've been glowing lately. I don't know what's changed, but It suits you. It's not a deep conversation, but it's something. Later, Peter jokingly refers to Meg as our little word wizard during a half-watched movie night. It's clumsy praise wrapped in Peterisms, but Meg hears what he's trying to say. She smiles. Thanks, Dad. Don't get cocky, he says, stuffing chips into his mouth. Still gotta clean the gutters tomorrow. Deal. Chris, too, has his moments. He bursts into her room one evening with a painting. I made this. It's us. You know, not hating each other. It's scribbly, messy, kind of weird. But Meg hangs it on her wall. That night, she journals longer than usual. She writes, maybe you don't need to fix everything. Maybe healing starts when you stop needing it to be tidy. Her world isn't perfect. Her family hasn't become emotionally literate overnight. But there's space now. For her, her voice, her weirdness, her softness. And that's enough. At school, the column continues to thrive. More students contribute now, anonymous confessions, tiny revolutions, vulnerable truths. Meg becomes a curator of emotions, weaving them into something that feels bigger than any one person. She's asked to mentor a few underclassmen for the next editorial team. I'm not going to be here forever, she says. You guys have to keep this going. They nod wide-eyed. One freshman says, you're like, the Meg Griffin, the one who changed everything. Meg laughs. Don't give me that much credit, I just told the truth. But inside, she feels it. She did change something. Not everything, but enough. As graduation creeps closer, Meg sits alone one day under the oak tree behind the school, a quiet ritual she's adopted. She opens her journal, starts writing. This time, it's not a column. It's a letter. To herself. To the girl she used to be. Dear Meg, I know you're tired. I know it feels like you've been screaming into a void your whole life. But guess what? You made it. You cracked through. You're not a punchline anymore. You're a poet, a builder, a soft warrior with an iron soul. She closes the journal and exhales. The wind rustles the pages like it's nodding. And for the first time in forever, Meg Griffin feels whole. Not because she was saved, but because she saved herself. Summer arrives quietly in Quar, not with fireworks or parades, but with soft breezes through window screens, lawn sprinklers clicking through empty yards, and long stretches of blue sky that feel like they might go on forever. And Meg, for once, feel like she has room to breathe in it all. The weight that used to sit on her shoulders, the ache of being misunderstood, unseen, passed over, hasn't vanished. But it's lighter now, manageable. Like a coat you can finally take off when you step inside somewhere warm. College acceptance letters arrive in waves. Some friends cry from rejection. Others post their I got in photos like confetti. Meg keeps hers quiet. She's been accepted to a state college nearby. Nothing flashy, nothing elite. But it feels right. Close enough to visit home. Far enough to grow. The thought of starting over somewhere new is both terrifying and thrilling. No more being stuck in a fixed identity. No more Meg Griffin, meaning one thing to everyone in the room before she's even said a word. It's a blank page. And now she knows how to write. Before school ends, the final issue of the student journal goes to print. The staff adds a special section titled Letters to Ourselves. Meg contributes anonymously, like always. Her letter reads, You survived. That was enough. But then you decided to live. That was everything. Karina tears up reading it. You're going to change more than this school, she tells Meg. You're going to change lives. Meg shrugs modestly. One invisible kid at a time. Karina smirks. You've never been invisible? The last day of school is surreal. Yearbooks are signed, lockers are emptied. Classrooms echo with the remnants of rushed goodbyes and final bell rings. Meg walks the halls slowly, memorizing every crack in the floor tile, every window frame where she once felt alone. Her favorite English teacher finds her in the hallway. You found your voice this year, he says. Whatever you do next, don't let the world quiet it down again. Meg thanks him with tears in her eyes. At home, the Griffins throw a graduation barbecue. It's chaotic, loud, full of mismatched paper plates and uninvited guests, but Meg doesn't mind. Peter tries to flip burgers while dancing to an 80s playlist. Lois hands out lemonade and fusses over whether the napkins are the right shade of blue. Stewie complains about the noise. Chris forgets to bring ice. Somehow it all works. At one point, Meg's aunt pulls her aside. You've grown up, she says softly. I remember when you were just a shy little thing, hiding behind your hair. Meg smiles. I still hide sometimes. Sure, her aunt says. But now it's because you choose when to be seen. That's power. Later that evening, after everyone's left and the grill's cooled, Meg finds herself on the porch alone, legs tucked under her, listening to the night bugs hum. Peter joins her with a soda in hand, sits beside her. You know, he says, I always thought of you as the quiet one, the weird one. Meg laughs softly. That's putting it mildly. But, he continues, maybe that's 'cause I didn't know how loud you could be when it mattered, or how smart you were, or how much guts you had to just keep showing up. Meg turns to him. Thanks, Dad. Peter shrugs. You're still gonna mow the lawn tomorrow. Deal. They sit there for a while longer, in rare and gentle silence. Summer nights stretch on. Meg starts volunteering at the local library on Thursdays. She signs up for a writing workshop at the community college to get a head start. She lets her hair grow longer, wears new colors, tries bold earrings that make her feel like a version of herself she hasn't met yet. Sometimes she still gets overlooked. Sometimes she still hears the echoes of old jokes whispered in the back of her mind. But they don't stick like they used to. They don't sting. One afternoon, she gets a message on social media from a girl she barely knows, a junior who used to sit in the far corner of homeroom. It reads, I read everything you wrote this year. I didn't know how to say it before, but thank you. You made me feel seen, like maybe I wasn't the only one trying to disappear. Meg responds with a simple, you never were, and you never have to again. Sometimes that's enough. And that's the thing Meg has come to understand. Not every story needs to end with applause or victory laps or sweeping changes. Sometimes the greatest revolution is a girl deciding to be real, deciding to take up space gently, deciding that she deserves to. Our story is still unfolding. There will be new cities, new people, new mirrors to stand before and wonder, is this who I am now? But this chapter, this quiet bloom from forgotten girl to soft voice of power, it matters. It always will. And if someone ever asks what happened to Meg Griffin, the real Meg, the one behind the silence and the smirks and the years of loneliness, you can say this: she didn't disappear. She just waited until the world was ready to see her. And then, she let herself be seen. The summer between high school and college brought a strange kind of stillness. Not boredom. Meg had long learned how to live with that, but a pause. A soft intermission. Like the town itself was holding its breath before everything shifted. Quahog in summer was a slow creature. Ice cream trucks moved like ghosts through overheated streets. Teenagers wandered sidewalks in flip-flops and oversized sunglasses. And in the evenings, the sky glowed gold before slipping into lavender, the color of soft endings. Meg would sit on the edge of her bed most evenings, one knee pulled to her chest, notebook balanced on the windowsill, writing without the pressure of assignments or judgment. Some nights she journaled. Some nights she wrote poetry that she would never show. But more often than not, she found herself writing letters to people she used to know, to people she hadn't met yet, and sometimes to versions of herself she was still trying to understand. She wrote one letter over and over again, though she never quite knew who it was for. I don't think I've ever been in love, not the way the movies talk about, but I think I've come close. I think I've brushed past it in hallways. I think I've felt it when someone remembered my name, or when someone looked at me and didn't flinch. Maybe love isn't the storm. Maybe it's the breeze. Meg didn't have some dramatic high school romance to carry with her into college. There were no epic love triangles or messy breakups. She had crushes, sure. A handful of flings that fizzled before they even started. She'd felt her heart skip for people who never saw her. And once or twice she thought she saw it flicker back in someone else. But it never lasted. There was Jeremy, the boy from Chem Lab who let her borrow his calculator and once asked if she wanted to walk to the vending machines together. He was tall, soft-spoken, and had this habit of doodling his notebook when the teacher wasn't looking. Meg liked that. She liked that he never talked down to her, never made her feel like a punchline. They had one almost moment, standing in the hall after class, both reaching for the same Dr. Pepper. Their fingers touched. He smiled. She smiled back. But then someone yelled his name across the hall, and the moment evaporated like steam. He waved goodbye. He never brought up the vending machine again. Meg carried that flicker with her for weeks. Then there was Hope, a senior who transferred in during Meg's junior year. She was effortlessly cool, wore combat boots with floral skirts, and had a laugh that felt like breaking rules. She edited the yearbook, played acoustic guitar, and gave Meg her first real compliment without any sarcasm attached. "You've got an old soul," she'd said, tapping Meg's notebook. I like that. They shared 3 lunch periods together, and for those 3 weeks, Meg found herself smiling more, laughing more, thinking about Hope's hands when she strummed her guitar, wondering what it meant when their legs touched under the table and neither of them moved away. It never turned into anything. Hope graduated early, moved to another state. But Meg kept a scrap of notebook paper she left behind. It read, "You see more than people know. Don't stop looking." She kept it folded in her diary. There were other small brushes with affection. A text that felt flirtier than usual, a hand that lingered too long during her group photo, the brief thrill of being chosen as a lab partner by someone attractive without having to ask. But mostly, Meg existed in the space between fantasy and fulfillment, between longing and loss, between the love stories told to others and the ones never written for girls like her. Still, she held on to hope. She believed in the quiet beginnings, the soft starts, the kind of affection that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but slipped into your life like sunlight through curtains. And now, with a college looming, she found herself wondering, would she be different? Would someone see her finally? Not just notice her, but recognize her? She didn't want fireworks. She wanted connection. One night in the late July, Meg went out with a group of classmates to a bonfire at the beach. It was one of those informal gatherings that everyone sort of heard about, but no one officially planned. The speaker played indie music. Someone brought marshmallows and sparklers. The waves murmured nearby, barely louder than the breeze. Meg stood near the edge of the firelight, arms crossed loosely, watching silhouettes laugh and sway in groups. And then someone approached her. A boy she vaguely remembered from sophomore math. Not someone she'd ever really spoken to. He had a calm presence, like he didn't need to talk to fill silence. He handed her a soda and said, "You always looked like you were thinking about something bigger." She blinked. "Is that a good thing?" "It is to me," he said. They talked for an hour, about music and art and what they were scared of. He asked what she wanted to study. She said maybe psychology. He said she already seemed good at understanding people. As the fire died down and the sky darkened, he offered her his hoodie. She declined. She wasn't cold, but something inside her felt warm in a way she couldn't quite explain. When they said goodbye, there was no dramatic kiss, no promise of a future. Just a smile that lingered, a look that felt kind. And for Meg, that was enough. On the drive home, she rolled down the windows, let the salt air tangle her hair, and thought, maybe love isn't the storm. Maybe it's the breeze. The memory stayed with her. Not because it turned into anything big, but because it didn't have to. It reminded her that love wasn't always about possession or declarations or even being chosen. Sometimes love was being seen. Sometimes it was just being met exactly where you stood, without judgment, without performance, without needing to explain why you'd been hiding. And as Meg lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, she whispered to herself, "I'm ready. Not for a soulmate, not for some epic romance, but for the possibility." The first few weeks of college were a blur, not in the partying, wild freedom kind of way. It wasn't like Meg suddenly became someone else the moment she stepped onto campus. But something had shifted. There was a sense of quiet possibility humming underneath everything, like the air itself carried potential. Nobody at this new school knew who she had been. No one saw her as the background character, the punching bag, the awkward, overlooked Griffin girl from Quahog. Here she was just Meg. No reputation trailing behind her. No pre-written script waiting to repeat. And that blank slate felt like freedom. She decorated her dorm room with soft lighting, old band posters, and thrifted fabrics. She kept her notebook by her pillow, wrote almost daily, and taped small affirmations to her mirror. "You are not invisible. You are in progress." In class, she spoke more than she ever had in high school. Not a lot, but enough to be noticed. Enough that a few classmates learned her name. Enough that one of them, Talia, a theater major with an asymmetrical haircut and a contagious laugh, invited her to join a late-night study group at the library. They studied once, then hung out again, then grabbed coffee, then walked the campus loop during one long evening of shared playlists and vulnerable stories. Talia had a way of making everything feel electric. She didn't flirt, not exactly, but she lingered. She leaned in closer when Meg talked. She teased gently, in a way that made Meg's stomach twist, not from discomfort, but from hope. One night, Talia invited her to a dorm party. Meg almost said no. She didn't feel ready. But something in Talia's eyes, soft, excited, made her say yes. The party was loud, bodies packed together, laughter and bass echoing through narrow hallways. Meg stuck close to Talia, letting the chaos swirl around her, like a movie playing behind glass. At some point, Talia took her hand, just lightly. A brush of fingers, a question. Meg didn't pull away. They found a quieter corner, a half-lit hallway near the stairwell. The music throbbed distantly. Someone laughed down the hall, but in that moment the world quieted. Talia looked at her. Really looked. You ever kissed a girl before? She asked, voice low. Meg nodded. A little lie, a little truth. She had imagined it 1,000 times. That had to count for something. Talia smiled. Want to try again? It wasn't fireworks. It was something gentler. A soft, hesitant kiss. A breath shared between them. A moment held, then passed. Talia pulled back, thumb brushing Meg's cheek. You okay? Meg nodded again, this time with honesty blooming in her chest. Yeah, she whispered. I think I am. They didn't become a couple. It wasn't that kind of story. Talia was wild and untethered and didn't believe in labels. Meg was still learning how to breathe in her own skin. But they stayed close for a while. They studied together, shared playlists, held hands when no one was looking, laughed in libraries, hugged too long after arguments that weren't really about anything. And then, one day, Talia drifted away. No big fight, no final conversation. Just a quiet pull in a different direction. New friends, new classes, less texting, less everything. Meg tried not to let it hurt, but it did. Because for a moment she had felt like she mattered, like someone had chosen her. And even if it wasn't forever, it had been real. She wrote about it in her notebook. Some people are poems, not novels. You don't get to keep them. But they still change your pages. As the semester wore on, Meg found herself caught in that strange, slow dance of figuring out who she was without someone else to reflect her back. She wasn't the girl who got laughed at in the cafeteria anymore, but she wasn't anyone's first choice either. She was still learning how to stand alone. There were other moments. A classmate who offered her his umbrella during a storm. A tutor who remembered how she took her coffee. A stranger on the bus who complimented her scarf and then got off at the next stop, never to be seen again. Little sparks, fleeting warmth. She wrote about those too. Love isn't always a chapter. Sometimes it's just a sentence. But some sentences stay with you forever. There were lonely nights too. Nights when the buzz of her phone never came. When the silence stretched too long. When she wondered if she was doing something wrong, or if she was just too quiet for a world that screamed. But even in those moments, she didn't feel erased. Just unfolding. Like the kind of flower that doesn't bloom in spring, but waits until late summer. Quiet, patient, sure of its time. She started noticing things she used to miss. The kindness in the way a professor remembered her name. The strength in the fact that she could walk across campus alone without needing to shrink. The peace that came from sitting under a tree, headphones on, sun painting freckles across her knees. Love, she was learning, wasn't always a person. Sometimes it was a place, a moment. A version of yourself that you could finally come home to. She wrote that too. Maybe love is the day you stop needing permission to exist. Meg didn't stop hoping for romance. She still daydreamed, still wrote letters she never sent, still imagined late-night conversations and someone whispering her name like a secret. But she stopped chasing, stopped begging to be seen. Because slowly, quietly, she was beginning to see herself. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to know she was worthy of more than scraps, of more than apology love, more than afterthought affection. And in the quiet of her dorm, between the hum of the heater and the soft rustle of notebook pages, she whispered something she had never dared say aloud before. I don't need to be someone else to be loved. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. It began not with fireworks, but with familiarity. Second semester started cold and gray, with snow piled high on the sidewalks and steam rising from every breath. Meg had grown quieter again, but not in the way she used to be. It wasn't retreat. It was reflection. There was a calm in her now, like she had stopped bracing for impact in every room she entered. She wore her headphones more often, always with a book tucked under her arm. She still sat in the back of class, but she didn't hunch anymore, and didn't fold into the background like before. She listened, she observed, she noticed. And one day, she noticed someone else. His name was Theo. Not the loudest in the room, not the best dressed or the most charming, but there was a steadiness to him, a soft energy that Meg felt drawn to before she even understood why. He had a habit of scribbling in the margins of his notebook. Not just notes, poems, sketches, lyrics maybe. Once Meg caught a glance of a cartoon dinosaur, sipping coffee with a tiny beret. It made her smile for a full hour. They shared a literature class, sat in the same row, a few seats apart. For weeks they exchanged glances, but no words. She thought he might have smiled once, but it could have been imagined. A flicker in her peripheral vision, nothing more. Until the day it wasn't. It was after class, cold outside. Her backpack strap had snapped, spilling books across the snowy concrete. Meg sighed, kneeling to gather them. Then, "Hey, wait. I got it." Theo. He bent to help her, hands careful with her books, like they were something delicate. He handed her the bell jar without saying anything, just a small nod. Meg stood there, blinking. "Thanks," she said, tucking her hair behind her ear. "No problem." He smiled again, more visible this time. "You know, I keep meaning to ask what you think of Plath." She blinked again, slower this time. And just like that, the silence broke. They walked together after class. Only a few blocks, only a few minutes. But it felt like a door opening. Theo was thoughtful. Funny in a quiet, clever way. He didn't try too hard. He didn't look through her. He looked at her, like she was a real person. Like what she said actually mattered. They started talking more after class, then in the library, then over coffee. He was the kind of person who remembered things. Her favorite tea. Her opinion on Virginia Woolf. The fact that she never wore gloves, even in snow. "I hate the way they make my hands feel trapped," she said once. "Freedom fighter for fingers," he replied, grinning. "I respect it." Their friendship bloomed in the in-between moments. Study sessions that stretched long past productivity. Shared playlists passed in text messages. Quiet walks where no one needed to fill the silence. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something else began to bloom too. Meg tried not to name it. Tried not to ruin it by wanting more. But she couldn't help it. There were nights she lay awake wondering what it would feel like to rest her head on his shoulder, to hold his hand without an excuse, to stop wondering if every smile meant something or if he was just being kind. She was terrified to hope, because hope had teeth, and she'd been bitten before. But Theo didn't vanish like the others. He didn't pull away when she got quiet or moody or distant. He just stayed, gentle, present, constant. One afternoon, they sat side by side on a stone bench outside the library, watching the snow melt into slush. Theo pulled out a thermos and poured her some tea. "Peppermint," he said, like it was obvious. "You remembered." He shrugged, cheeks pink in the cold. "I remember things that matter." Meg felt the words stick in her throat. She looked down, then back up. "You matter," she said, barely above a whisper. Theo met her eyes. Didn't flinch. Didn't laugh. Just nodded once like he had been waiting. "So do you." For a moment, Meg forgot how to breathe. They didn't kiss. Not then. Not yet. But something passed between them. A quiet current, steady and warm and impossible to ignore. From then on, it was different. They didn't define it, didn't rush, but their hands brushed more often. Their conversations went deeper. Their silences felt like trust, not tension. And Meg, awkward, invisible Meg, began to feel like she was part of something delicate and real. For the first time in her life, the attention she was receiving didn't feel conditional. It didn't come with a punchline. It wasn't based on pity or proximity or projection. It was earned. Through time. Through truth. Through tenderness. Theo liked her for who she was, not who she pretended to be. And slowly that made Meg start liking herself too. There was no makeover, no big transformation scene, no moment where she stepped out in a new dress and everyone gasped. But there were small victories. She started laughing louder. She stopped apologizing so much. She raised her hand in class and didn't shrink when eyes turned toward her. She spoke up in group projects. She said no when she meant no, and yes when she actually meant yes. And with Theo, she allowed herself to be open, vulnerable, honest. They read poetry to each other, sometimes serious, sometimes absurd. She read him one of her own ones, something raw and clumsy and real, and he didn't laugh. He just said, "You have a voice. Don't let the world make you forget that." She cried that night, but not from sadness, from gratitude. Meg had spent so much of her life believing she needed to be someone else to be loved, that she had to perform or conform, or shrink herself to fit inside someone else's idea of who she should be. But with Theo, she began to understand that real connection came from showing up as herself, messy, thoughtful, anxious, strange, and trusting that it was enough. Not perfect, not always understood, but enough. And that was the first time she truly began to believe that love, real love, might actually be possible for someone like her. Not because she had changed, but because she had stopped hiding. But as with most stories, stitched together in softness, the world eventually demands a reckoning. It didn't happen suddenly. There wasn't a singular betrayal or a sudden storm. Instead, it came gradually, like a fog creeping in around the edges of something beautiful. At first, it was just a shift. Theo began answering texts later than usual. He canceled a coffee date with little notice. Once he forgot she hated marshmallows in her hot chocolate. An innocent slip, but for Meg, it echoed louder than it should have. She didn't say anything. Not at first. She told herself not to be paranoid, not to overthink, not to ruin what they had by asking for too much. But silence bred doubt. And Meg knew doubt well. It had lived in her bones for years, whispering that she wasn't enough, that even the people who cared would eventually drift away, that love was a trick of timing, not truth. Then came the conversation. They were sitting in Theo's room, surrounded by warm light and scattered books. She noticed he'd moved the picture they'd taken together last month, once front and center on the desk, now tucked to the side. "Hey," she said quietly, picking it up. "Why'd you move this?" Theo looked up from his laptop, blinking. No reason, just needed space. He said it casually, like it was nothing. But Meg heard the weight beneath it. Space. She set the photo down gently. "Is something going on?" He hesitated, fingers resting on the keyboard. "Meg, you're great, really, He sighed. "I've been feeling a little off lately, a lot of school pressure. My mom's been calling constantly. I don't know, I just need to focus on some things." Meg nodded slowly. The conversation continued, but she barely heard it. Something inside her had already gone quiet. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't dismissive, but he was pulling away, and she could feel it in every unspoken word. When she got home that night, she didn't cry. She just sat on her bed, the picture frame still in her bag, and stared at the ceiling. This was the part she knew too well. The drift, the fade, the slow unraveling of something precious, thread by thread. She didn't reach out again. Not for days. She waited. Let the space breathe. Let the silence settle. When Theo finally messaged her, it was simple. Hey, I hope you're okay. Just wanted to say thanks for everything. You really helped me through a weird time. There was no question mark, no invitation to continue. Just gratitude and goodbye. Meg read the message 3 times, then put her phone down. No explosion, no confrontation, just an ending wrapped in politeness. And for some reason, that made it hurt more. Because it meant he still cared. Just not enough. She didn't reply that night. Instead, she went for a walk, alone. Cold air biting at her cheeks, hands stuffed in her coat pockets. Memories floated through her like drifting leaves. Theo's laugh. The way he looked at her when she read aloud. The way he said her name. Soft, unhurried, like it was something safe. And then she remembered what he said once. You matter. At the time, it had felt like the beginning of something real. Now it felt like a souvenir from a version of her that no longer existed. The next morning, Meg replied, Thank you. I'm glad I met you too. Take care. That was it. No desperation, no begging, no performance. She had learned something important, something she hadn't known before this. Sometimes people come into your life to help you see yourself, not to stay forever, not to promise a future, just to hold a mirror up to your heart and say, look, there you are. You were always there. And for the first time in her life, Meg didn't feel erased by a goodbye. It still hurt. Of course it did. But it didn't shatter her. Because what she had found in Theo was more than a crush, more than a fleeting connection. It was proof. Proof that she was lovable. Proof that she could open up without falling apart. Proof that being seen didn't always end in mockery. The pain didn't erase the joy. The ending didn't rewrite the whole story. And Meg, quiet, bruised, and resilient. Meg understood that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the lesson without the weight. So she went back to class, sat in the same seat, read the same books. But she wasn't the same. She raised her hand more often. She wrote poems again. She even joined the campus zine, anonymously submitting a short story about a girl who kept losing people and finding pieces of herself in their absence. When the editor posted it, the comments poured in. Beautiful. Heartbreaking. Felt like someone finally wrote how I feel. Meg didn't reply to any of them. But she read each one, eyes stinging, chest full. That night, she looked in the mirror, really looked, and for once didn't flinch. The girl who stared back wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't loud. She wasn't popular. She wasn't anyone's dream girl. But she was there, and that was enough. The next week, Meg walked past Theo in the hallway. He looked up surprised and gave a small wave. She nodded back, a tiny smile. No bitterness, no regret, just recognition. Two people who shared something real, however brief, and who, in their own way, helped each other grow. As she walked away, and the snow began to fall again. Light, soft, quiet. Just like her. But this time, she didn't feel small beneath it. She felt steady. She felt seen. Coming home was quieter than she expected. Not that she had expected balloons or fanfare. But there was something about the stillness of the Griffin household that made Meg pause for a moment at the door before stepping inside. The same crooked family photo still hung on the wall. The same faint hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the background. And the familiar scent of cheap air freshener lingered faintly in the hall. Everything was the same. And yet Meg wasn't. It was strange how time moved inside the house on Spooner Street. As if the walls had no idea months had passed. As if they hadn't noticed she'd been gone at all. The couch still had that one spring that poked up from underneath. Brian's novel in progress still sat unfinished on the coffee table. Stewie was tinkering with something strange in the corner. Peter laughed at the TV without really watching it, and Lois hummed absent-mindedly as she stirred something in the kitchen. They all looked up as she walked in. "Hey, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Peter said, half chewing a pretzel stick. "Did the convent kick you out or something?" Lois shot him a look. "Peter." But Meg only smiled faintly. She didn't expect warmth, not here, not anymore. "Hey," she said simply, dropping her bag near the stairs. Lois came over, brushing her hands dry on a towel. "You didn't tell me what time you were getting in." Meg shrugged. "Wasn't sure until last minute. I got an earlier train." "Well, I'm glad you're here," Lois said, her voice hovering somewhere between sincerity and exhaustion. "We'll have dinner soon. You hungry?" "Not really," Meg replied, eyes scanning the room, trying to map herself back into its familiar angles. Chris wandered in from the hallway, holding a sandwich in each hand. "Meg, did you die at college? I told everyone you died." We had a whole minute of silence. She blinked. "What?" "Then Dad farted," Chris added with a grin. "So it kind of ruined it." Peter chuckled proudly. Classic. Meg let out a breath, a soft, dry laugh escaping before she could stop it. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was resilience. But part of her knew how to slip back into the rhythm, even if it felt strange now, like a pair of shoes that no longer quite fit. Dinner was the usual Griffin family chaos, noisy, scattered, a strange ballet of interruptions and nonsense. Peter complained about something on TV. Stewie muttered darkly to himself between bites of mashed potatoes. Brian tried to correct Lois on something political and was summarily ignored. Meg mostly listened. She wasn't sure how to reinsert herself. She'd built a different version of herself in quiet moments at college, one that didn't ask for permission to exist. But here, everything snapped back so easily to the old pattern as though she had never left. At one point, Peter turned to her with mock surprise. "So, college girl, you become a doctor yet? Or just wasting our money on those, what do you call them, feelings classes?" "I'm actually studying literature," she said calmly without flinching. Peter snorted. "So, unemployed, got it." Chris laughed, spraying crumbs. Meg didn't respond, not because she was hurt, but because it was so expected, so rehearsed. Only this time something shifted. She met Peter's eyes and she smiled. Not bitter, not defensive. Just tired of playing a game that no longer interested her. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I've been writing, published a few pieces. People liked them." There was a moment of silence. Not long, but long enough. Brian raised his eyebrows. "Really? That's actually impressive." Peter blinked. "Well, as long as you're not writing about me, I don't need the world knowing about my rash." Meg didn't reply. She didn't need to. Later, upstairs in her room, she stood in the doorway for a long time. Everything was still where she had left it. Posters curling at the corners, old notebooks stacked on the shelf, a lamp with a bent neck, a faded sweater draped over the chair. It was like a time capsule. Except the girl it had been built for didn't feel like the one standing there now. She dropped her overnight bag on the floor and sat on the bed, letting her fingers trace the edge of the comforter. It felt too soft. She wasn't sure how to settle into the space anymore. She'd built a new one, even if only temporary, even if only rented by semesters and breaks. But it had been hers. It had fit her. This one felt like it belonged to a ghost she'd outgrown. There was a knock. "Come in," she said, half knowing who it would be. Lois stepped in, arms folded loosely. "You okay?" "Yeah," Meg replied. "Just weird being back." "I can imagine." They were both quiet for a moment. "I know it wasn't always easy here," Lois said eventually. Meg looked at her. "You think?" Lois winced slightly. "I mean, I know we weren't always as supportive as we could have been. You've been through a lot, Meg." Meg didn't reply. Lois stepped further in. "I read one of your stories, the one about the girl who disappears in her own home." That caught Meg's attention. "I found it online," Lois added quickly. "You didn't say it was published." Meg looked down at her hands. "Didn't think you'd read it." "I did," Lois said. "And it was good. Really good." Meg swallowed. "It wasn't just a story. I figured." Another pause. "I didn't know how invisible you felt," Lois said softly. "And that's on me." There it was. Not a full apology. Not a grand declaration. But something real. Meg didn't know what to say. Not yet. So she nodded. Lois smiled faintly. "I'll let you rest." As she turned to leave, Meg spoke. "Thanks for reading it." Lois stopped, turned back. "I'm proud of you, Meg." And then she left, quietly closing the door behind her. Meg sat there in the silence. It was still hard to trust it, to believe that things could change, but maybe they didn't need to change all at once. Maybe it was enough that someone had finally read her words and seen her. She lay back on the bed and let the weight of the ceiling press gently against her thoughts. Meg didn't sleep that night, not fully. Instead, she drifted between half-formed dreams and sharp-edged thoughts, her eyes open more often than closed. The house groaned in the quiet hours like it always did, old bones shifting under the weight of time. She could hear the creak of pipes, the whir of a bathroom fan someone forgot to turn off, and occasionally the familiar thump of Peter sleepwalking into a wall. But under all that noise, there was something deeper, an echo of old silences. The kind that used to consume her room when she'd cry into a pillow, wondering if anyone would notice if she just stopped speaking altogether. She remembered the times she rehearsed conversations in the mirror, hoping for someone, anyone, to ask how she was doing. But no one ever did. Now she didn't need them to. That was the difference. The next morning came with an awkward kind of warmth. Chris was making pancakes, a rare act of generosity that usually ended in a flour explosion. Peter was in his robe, watching a Spanish soap opera with deep emotional investment, even though he didn't speak Spanish. Lois moved around the kitchen with the practiced grace of someone who had long since made peace with the madness around her. Meg sat at the table, sipping coffee, watching it all. It wasn't that she didn't belong here. She did. But the version of her that once needed their attention, that once craved their validation, was fading. She didn't need their permission to matter. She was already real. Chris flopped into the seat next to her. "Hey, Meg, if I put jelly on a pancake, is it still breakfast, or does it become dessert?" "Depends," Meg said, playing along. "Is the jelly red or purple?" Chris looked genuinely concerned. "Oh, man, I didn't think about color." She smiled. "Hey, so are you going to write about us?" he asked suddenly, looking at her with wide, curious eyes. "Like, in one of your stories?" She paused, then answered honestly. Maybe, but not the way you think. Chris nodded slowly. Make me tall. Meg chuckled. Deal. Peter turned toward her suddenly. Hey, Meg, your mom said you're writing books now. That true or just one of those things moms say when they're trying to make you sound more interesting at family dinners? I write essays and stories, Meg said. Mostly short pieces. Peter narrowed his eyes. Are they funny? Sometime. You should write jokes for me. Like a ghost joke writer. A spooky, invisible nerd. Lois walked in just in time to hear that. Peter, stop bothering her. Peter shrugged. I'm just saying, if I had a ghost writing my jokes, I'd be hilarious and haunted. Meg leaned back in her chair, watching them interact like a detached observer in a wildlife documentary. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The difference was on the inside now. Later that day, she wandered through the town. Quahog hadn't changed either. Same cracked sidewalks, same overgrown yards, same weird guy in a robe feeding pigeons Doritos. But in the spaces between those familiar sights, Meg saw herself differently. This was where she'd been dismissed, overlooked, mocked, and forgotten. But now she carried her own story. And that meant the town couldn't take her from herself anymore. She passed the high school, stared at its bleak brick face, the windows that once framed her worst days. She remembered the lockers slamming, the quiet giggles that weren't quiet enough, the names whispered like spells designed to erase her. There was a moment, just a moment, where the old pain bubbled up. But it passed. She wasn't that girl anymore. She kept walking, eventually ending up at the park near the edge of town. It was mostly empty except for a mother chasing a toddler and an old man dozing on a bench. She sat down, pulled out her phone, and opened the Notes app. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then slowly she started typing. There was a girl who disappeared, not all at once, but in fragments. A laugh left behind here. A question unanswered there. Until one day, she was just a shadow of a shadow. But shadows are born of light, and light always finds its way back. She stopped, read it over, then smiled faintly. It wasn't perfect, but it was true, and it was hers. When she returned home, Stewie was waiting by the stairs, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. You're being suspiciously self-reflective, he said. That either means you're planning a memoir or a mass disappearance. Meg gave him a look. What do you want, Stewie? I'm not here to criticize, he said, lifting a tiny hand in mock innocence. I'm here to observe. It seems you've returned from your exile with some form of self-worth. How unexpected. She smirked. You miss me, don't you? I miss the version of you who'd spiral from a misplaced comment. It was entertaining. Well, get used to disappointment. He sniffed. We'll see. Emotional regression is always one family dinner away. Meg laughed. You're not wrong. He looked at her then, serious for just a second. You're different. I am. Good. Then he waddled away, muttering something about calibrating lasers. The rest of the evening passed in its usual haze. Dinner, background television, random chaos. But as the hours folded into one another, Meg sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, notebook open. She wasn't writing for class, not for publication, not even for anyone else. She was writing for her. The door creaked behind her. Lois peeked in. You're still up? Just writing. Lois walked in and sat across from her. Can I ask you something? Meg nodded. Why do you write? It was a big question. Bigger than she expected. But she didn't rush her answer. Because it makes me feel real, she said finally. When I put something down on paper, it's like I exist outside of all this. Lois nodded slowly, absorbing it. I wish I had known that sooner, she said softly. Meg smiled gently. It's okay. I didn't know it either. Not until I left. There was silence again, but not the painful kind. This one felt warm, healing. And for the first time in a long time, Meg didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Not by everyone, not even by most, but by herself. And that was enough. Night settled over the Griffin house with a familiar hush, but tonight it felt less like a silence of neglect and more like a silence of peace. The kind of quiet that comes when someone has finally stopped trying to be heard by people who never listened. Meg lay in bed, the notebook resting on her stomach, filled with half-thoughts, unfinished lines, and scribbled truths she never expected to write. She stared up at the ceiling, breathing evenly, feeling the presence of her own life finally settled inside her like a steady heartbeat. It was strange how nothing had changed around her. The hallway was still a gauntlet of half-closed doors and flickering bulbs. The bathroom sink still leaked when the knob wasn't twisted just right. And yet something fundamental had shifted inside Meg, not dramatically, not like a thunderclap or a movie montage, more like the slow tide pulling in, grain by grain, until the beach was reshaped entirely. The next morning, she woke early. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She opened her window and let the air in, cool and tinged with salt from the harbor. She stood there for a long time, just breathing, watching the world stir itself awake. The sun touched the rooftops of Quahog in gold, and for the first time in a long time, Meg didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like part of it. At breakfast, no one said much. Peter was flipping through channels like he was mining for treasure. Lois was sipping coffee and scanning coupons. Chris was drawing on the kitchen wall with a marker he swore wasn't permanent. But Meg didn't need conversation. She didn't need grand gestures or apologies. She was past needing them. "Mom," she said casually, "I'm thinking about applying to a creative writing program next year." Lois blinked. That's wonderful, Meg. You've always been good at writing." Meg raised an eyebrow. "Have I?" "Well," Lois faltered. "I mean, I always had a feeling." Meg smiled faintly. "Thanks." Peter looked up. "Wait, does that mean you'll move out?" Meg nodded. "Eventually." He gave a mock salute. "Godspeed." Chris looked up from his art. "Will you still come back and visit for Thanksgiving and help me fake being normal in front of Grandma?" Meg grinned. "Of course." As much as they joked and bumbled, there was something genuine in their voices. They didn't know how to say they were proud, but she didn't need them to. She could read between their lines now. She had learned to decode the language of people who rarely said what they meant, but meant more than they realized. Later, she packed a small backpack and walked into town. Not to escape it, but to explore it differently. She passed by the diner where she'd once overheard someone from school say, "Meg Griffin still goes here?" Oh. She remembered that sting so vividly. But today, she walked past it like a breeze through fog, unbothered, untouched. She stopped at a bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a vape shop. It was the kind of place with creaky floors and a dusty cat that ignored everyone. Meg ran her fingers across the spines of books until one caught her eye, a worn paperback with the title Invisible Ink. She flipped it open and skimmed a few lines. Some stories live quietly, not because they lack weight, but because they've learned the value of shadows. Some people, too, live like that, until one day they don't. She bought it, not because it was fate or a sign or anything dramatic, but because it felt true. Outside the store, she sat on a bench and began to read. The town moved around her. Cars honked, people shouted, seagulls cried overhead. But inside the pages, everything was still. For a little while, Meg belonged to a world where she was both reader and writer, where invisibility wasn't a curse. It was a space waiting to be filled with her own voice. By afternoon, she had walked the length of the harbor. The sun glimmered on the water, and boats bobbed gently into their slips. She found a spot on the edge of the dock, kicked off her shoes, and dangled her feet above the water. Then she took out her notebook. This time her pen didn't hesitate. There was once a girl who tried to be everything everyone wanted. She tried to be invisible so they'd stop hurting her. She tried to be loud so they'd notice her. She tried to be quiet so they'd forget the times they mocked her. But in the end, she stopped trying. She just was. And that was the beginning. She sat there for a long time after she finished the paragraph, watching the words settle into the page. No one else would read them today, maybe not for a long time. But they existed. She had existed, fully, completely. Not as a joke, not as a punching bag, but as Meg Griffin. On her way back home, she passed by a group of kids from James Woods High. One of the girls giggled and whispered something to the others. Meg could feel the old instinct rise, shoulders tense, eyes darting, heart tightening. But then, nothing. It passed like a wave brushing against a stronger shore. They didn't matter. They never really did. At home, Stewie met her in the hallway. "I've been reviewing your recent behavior," he said, eyes narrowed. "It's unsettling. You're exhibiting signs of resilience, emotional competence, even, dare I say, dignity. I don't like it." "Too bad," Meg said, stepping past him. "You used to be so delightfully tragic," he called after her. "I'm still a little tragic," she replied. "Just on my own terms now." That night, she opened a blank Word document on her laptop. Not a journal, not a note, a manuscript. No title yet, no outline, just the first sentence. They never saw her coming, not because she was hidden, but because they never bothered to look. She stared at it for a while, and added a second sentence. Then a third. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. She kept writing. The words kept coming, not like a flood, but like a steady stream, clear, gentle, and certain. Meg wasn't writing for validation anymore. She wasn't writing to prove something or to scream into a void. She was writing to understand, to reflect, to finally have a conversation with a version of herself she'd long buried beneath everyone else's opinions. Outside her window, the Griffin house was quiet again. Stewie's nightlight flickered behind his door. Chris was likely already snoring, tangled in his bedsheets, like a dreaming mastodon. Peter had fallen asleep with the TV on again. Lois would be downstairs, flipping through a magazine she didn't care about, sipping the last of her chamomile tea. Everything was the same. And yet, in this moment, Meg felt like she was living in a completely different house. One where she wasn't hiding anymore. One where the silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space she could finally fill with her own voice. She paused her typing and leaned back. The screen glowed soft against the darkness of her room. On the nightstand was her copy of Invisible Ink, the spine now creased and loved. She reached for it, flipping to the back pages where she'd tucked old photographs. There weren't many. Most of her life had gone undocumented except for the awkward Christmas cards and school photos that hung in the hallway like a shrine to indifference. But here, tucked between these pages, were the ones she'd kept for herself. A photo of her at the beach when she was 6, hair wild, eyes bright. One of her in the school play in 8th grade, dressed as a tree, but beaming like she was center stage. Another, more recent. One she'd taken in the bathroom mirror. No filters, no edits. Just her, looking into her own eyes. "I see you," she whispered to that reflection. "I really do." It was something no one else had ever said to her. Not her parents, not her friends, not even her teachers, who often forgot she was even in class. But Meg was learning that self-recognition was more powerful than external praise. Seeing herself, truly seeing herself, was worth more than 1,000 likes or apologies. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm. She showered, dressed in her favorite oversized hoodie and jeans, and tied her hair up in a loose bun. She looked in the mirror and smiled, not because she looked flawless, but because she looked like herself, and that was enough. She grabbed her bag, tossed in her notebook, and headed downstairs. Breakfast was the usual mess. Peter had made waffles, and then somehow managed to drop them into the toaster. Chris was drawing on his arm with mustard. Lois looked like she hadn't slept. "Morning," Meg said, her tone light, confident. Lois glanced up. "You're up early again." "Yeah," Meg replied, pouring herself some cereal. "I've been writing." Lois tilted her head. "That's great, sweetie." Peter looked up from his waffle ashes. "If you write a book, can I be in it? I want to be the guy who solves crimes with a talking dog, but also runs a chicken nugget empire." Meg chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." Chris smiled. "You can write about me, too. I'm going to be famous one day. Like for real. Maybe I'll be in your movie adaptation." "Deal," Meg said. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like a real conversation. Not just background noise or awkward filler. There was warmth, maybe even curiosity. Like they were all waking up to the idea that Meg Griffin wasn't a background character in their lives anymore. Later that day, she stopped by the school counselor's office. Not because she was in trouble or needed permission, but because she wanted to ask about scholarships for creative writing. Mrs. Langston blinked at her, surprised. "You're interested in writing programs?" "Yes," Meg replied. "I'm already working on a manuscript. I figured it's time I start planning ahead." Mrs. Langston nodded, flipping through a drawer. "Well, it's never too early, and I'm glad you came in. You've always been quiet, Meg, but I think you've got more in you than people realize." Meg smiled. "I think so, too." The counselor handed her a few pamphlets. Meg tucked them into her bag, her heart buzzing, not with nerves, but excitement. It was rare, this feeling. Hope with a side of quiet confidence. After school, she passed by the empty auditorium. The drama club had ended early. The room was dim, seats scattered with programs from last week's show. On a whim, she walked to the stage, climbed up, and stood in the spotlight. No one was watching. There were no scripts, no lines to remember. Just her, breathing in the stillness. She walked to center stage, took a deep breath, and whispered, "This is what it feels like to not be invisible." Her voice echoed gently off the walls, not loud, but strong. "Back home," she typed, until her fingers ached. The story was no longer fictional. It was real, hers. She didn't know how it would end, but for once, it didn't matter. She was writing it, and that was what counted. That night, Stewie poked his head into her room again. "So," he said, arms crossed, "this whole personal growth thing, are you planning to maintain it? Or is this just a phase before your next depressive spiral?" Meg looked up unfazed. "Probably a bit of both." Stewie raised an eyebrow. "Well, at least you're honest." "Thank," she said. "You want to read something I wrote?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Me? Read your work?" "Yeah," she said. "You're probably the only one in this house who'd give real feedback." There was a pause. Then, slowly, Stewie entered and perched on the edge of her desk. She handed him a few pages. As he read, the room went still. And for once, Meg didn't feel like she was waiting for approval. She just watched him read, calm and patient. He looked up after a minute. "It's not bad. Your sentence structure's competent. Themes are layered. A bit sentimental, but I suppose that's part of your charm." Meg grinned. "Thanks, Dewey." He handed it back. "Don't let it go to your head." And then he left, muttering about how he needed to adjust to this strange new reality where Meg Griffin was no longer pathetic. Alone again, Meg looked at the pages in her hand and smiled. His silence after Stewie left wasn't empty. It was full of something rare in the Griffin household. Respect. Maybe not shouted, maybe not plastered across the walls and banners, but there it was. Quiet, subtle, but real. And for Meg, that quiet recognition from the sharpest mind in the house felt like a heavier weight had lifted off her shoulders than she even realized she was carrying. The pages of her writing rested beside her now like old friends. The story she was crafting no longer felt like a distant dream or an escape route. It felt like a mirror. Every page was an excavation, a slow and gentle uncovering of the girl beneath the surface. And with every sentence, she began to stitch herself together, not as the version everyone else tolerated, but as the person she was finally starting to understand. Later that week, Meg found herself standing in the school library, fingers trailing across the spines of books that once intimidated her. Virginia Woolf, Zadie Smith, Joan Didion, authors who turned pain into power. She used to avoid this aisle, too lofty, too distant. But now she was pulling them out, reading lines at random, tasting the texture of their words like someone who had been starving and just realized what a feast literature could be. She borrowed 3 books and tucked them into her bag like treasure. On the walk home, the streets of Quahog felt a little different. Not prettier, not cleaner, but more textured. She noticed things she usually ignored, the way the breeze kicked up the leaves near the park, the sound of distant lawnmowers humming their mechanical lullabies, the way a group of kids on bikes laughed without holding back. Meg watched, listened, and recorded it all in her mind, not because she was trying to escape into someone else's life, but because she was collecting moments for her own. That night after dinner, during which Peter accidentally used dish soap instead of syrup and somehow set the microwave on fire, Meg slipped outside with her notebook and a blanket. She curled up on the front steps, where the porch light cast a dim golden halo over her scribbling hands. The air was crisp, the kind that nudges your thoughts awake. She started writing again, but this time, it wasn't about pain or invisibility. It was about noticing, about curiosity, about the little fragments that make up a day that otherwise might have gone unlived. A cat darted across the street. A car with bass-heavy music rolled by, windows down. A couple of fireflies blinked in and out of existence like tiny stage lights rehearsing for a grand show. Meg wrote it all down. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because the act of writing no longer felt like a scream. It felt like a song only she could hear, and that made it sacred. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened, not in a dramatic Hollywood ending way, but in the way real life sometimes gently nudges you in a new direction. One afternoon during English class, the teacher, Mr. Heron, announced a school-wide short story contest. "Winner gets published in the Quahog Quarterly," he said, holding up a well-worn copy of the local lit magazine, "and a gift card to Dairy Queen, which frankly is more valuable if you ask me." The class laughed, except Meg. She didn't laugh because she was already somewhere else, half in her chair, half in her head, mentally rifling through the stories she'd been writing, wondering which one might be ready, Which one might be brave enough to step into the light? She went home that day in a kind of electric hush. No jokes, no sighs, no muttered frustrations about being overlooked. Just focus. That night she edited for hours, cut lines, rewrote scenes, tightened metaphors. She'd never worked so precisely before, not because she feared judgment, but because she respected the work. This wasn't about winning. This was about declaring, quietly but firmly, that she had something to say. She submitted her story 2 days later. The confirmation email popped up during lunch between bites of a sandwich and the distant sound of Peter trying to use the blender to make spaghetti. Meg didn't tell anyone. Not because she was scared, but because this was hers. Sacred. Not something to shout from the rooftops or post on social media. She was learning that power didn't always have to announce itself. Sometimes it just sat with you quietly like a cat on your lap, warm, content, watching. 2 weeks passed. Meg kept writing. She also kept living, which was new. She didn't hole up in her room as much. She sat on the front lawn some afternoons. She walked to the local bookstore. She even attended a poetry reading at a nearby cafe, where a girl in a floral skirt read verses about her grandmother's garden, and Meg nearly cried into her hot chocolate. Then one morning, the email came. Subject line: "Congratulations, Megan Griffin." Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. She read the message once, then again, then one more time, just to be sure. Her story had won. It would be published in the next issue of the Quahog Quarterly. She stared at the screen for a long time, not because she doubted it, but because it felt surreal to be seen, truly seen, and recognized. When she told her family that evening, the reactions were as predictably chaotic as expected. Peter screamed, "I'm gonna be the dad of a famous author. I always knew you were gonna be the next J.K. Rowling Pins." Chris clapped like a seal, yelling, "Wait, are we gonna be rich now? Can I have a pool shaped like a sword?" Lois smiled and said, "I'm proud of you, Meg," in a voice that was genuinely sincere, not just performative. Stewie raised his glass of juice. "Well, the literary world has officially lowered its standards, but nonetheless, cheers." Meg laughed. It was messy, loud, a bit absurd. But it was good. It was real. And it was hers. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her heart light but steady. She wasn't dreaming about being someone else anymore. She wasn't yearning for another life, another family, another name. She was Meg Griffin. Writer, observer, survivor. And for once, that title didn't feel ironic. It felt earned. The next few weeks passed, not with dramatic highs or cinematic montages, but with something more nourishing, normalcy. Meg's story was printed in the Quahog Quarterly, tucked neatly between a poem about seagulls and an essay on the philosophy of sandwich layering. She picked up a few copies from the local bookstore and held one in her hands for a long while. The cover wasn't flashy, there was no spotlight, but seeing her words on paper, printed and bound, was like seeing her name carved into the world in a quiet, permanent way. Her classmates didn't suddenly crown her queen or rush to befriend her, but some of them approached her in the hallways. A girl from math class said she liked the way Meg described shadows. A boy from history, who never once made eye contact with her before, asked how she came up with her story's ending. It wasn't applause, but it was connection. She began helping in the library during free periods, not because she had to, but because it felt right. Reshelving books, tidying reading corners, recommending a novel to a curious freshman. These were small things, but in their smallness they felt like rituals. Like Meg was taking part in building a space where quiet people could feel seen. At home, things didn't change drastically, but there were glimmers. Peter still blundered through each day like a wrecking ball with feelings, but he occasionally peeked into a room and asked, "You writing anything new, champ?" He never stayed long, he never understood the depth, but he was trying in his own strange Peter way. Lois began leaving folded laundry on her bed more neatly, slipping in the occasional compliment about Meg's dedication or her thoughtful nature, even if those words felt borrowed from a parenting book. Chris once tried to write a story too. It was mostly about a magic cheeseburger that fought crime. But he read it to Meg, and she listened all the way through, and when he finished, she told him she loved the villain's name. Colonel Ketchup did have a certain ring to it. And Stewie? Stewie began sneaking her books. Sometimes she'd find one on her bed after school, always without a note, always meticulously selected. Classics, essays, satire, modern fiction. It was his way. Subtle, calculated, aloof. But Meg understood what he was doing. It was his version of a conversation, and she appreciated every silent word. There was a day, shortly after the magazine release, when Meg caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She paused, studied it, not out of vanity, but curiosity. The face, looking back, still had the same tired eyes, the same familiar hair, the same ever-so-slight slouch. But something was different. Something in the way she held herself. She no longer looked like someone who was waiting to be erased. She looked present, planted, real. Meg began journaling not just stories, but her days. Not dramatic events or rants, but impressions. The way the sky looked before a storm. The sound of the dishwasher at night. The strange rhythm of her family's chaos, and how oddly she found beauty in its predictability. She wrote not to escape, but to capture. To live inside the moment she used to drift through unnoticed. One evening, sitting on the roof with a thermos of tea in her notebook, Meg let herself wonder something she hadn't before. What if being invisible had been her gift all along? Not a punishment, not a flaw, but a vantage point. She had watched her family from the sidelines for so long, studied their habits, absorbed their nonsense, learned their rhythms, and in that observation, she'd seen truths others missed. She knew when Peter's jokes were a cover for his insecurity. She could tell when Lois was silently exhausted but pushing through. She noticed when Chris was at his most creative, even when no one else did. She recognized Stewie's loneliness, masked behind genius and sarcasm. Meg had always seen them, even when they hadn't seen her. Maybe that was her power. Maybe she was a quiet anchor in a house that rarely stopped spinning. There was comfort in that. She didn't need to be loud to be strong. She didn't need applause to have worth. She didn't need transformation to have arrived. She was Meg, and Meg was enough. That truth didn't crash into her like a wave. It arrived like morning light, gradually, gently, with soft certainty. It warmed her edges. It didn't erase the years of pain or the scars of being overlooked, but it made peace with them. She finished her tea and looked out across the sleeping neighborhood. Porch lights flickered. Distant dogs barked. A breeze carried the smell of someone grilling late into the evening. Meg closed her notebook and smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because for once, nothing needed fixing. She was here. She was whole. And she wasn't disappearing anymore. Back in her room, she tucked the notebook away and turned off the lamp. The darkness wrapped around her like a blanket. Not lonely, not cold, just still. In the silence, Meg Griffin fell asleep, not wondering who she needed to become, but finally at peace with who she already was,